What if I told you that right now, as you're lying in bed listening to this, there are workers on oil rigs in the middle of nowhere experiencing things that would make your worst nightmares seem like pleasant dreams? Tonight, I'm going to share with you 10 of the most terrifying, bone-chilling stories from offshore oil rigs that have haunted the men and women who live to tell about them. These aren't just stories passed down through generations. These are real accounts from real people who faced something so horrifying on those isolated platforms that they quit their high-paying jobs and never looked back. Before we dive into the abyss of terror, let me ask you something. Have you ever been completely alone in the dark, so far from civilization that screaming wouldn't matter because no one would hear you anyway? Well, imagine that feeling, but you're surrounded by hundreds of tons of steel and machinery in the middle of the ocean, where the nearest land is hundreds of miles away. That's where our stories begin tonight. So turn off your lights, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for a journey into the unknown. But I'm warning you now, after tonight, you might never look at the ocean the same way again. Have you ever been alone in a building late at night and heard sounds coming from inside the walls? The settling of old wood, the expansion and contraction of metal, the gurgling of pipes? Most of the time, these are perfectly normal sounds that seem sinister only because of the darkness and our own imagination. But sometimes, just sometimes, those sounds are something else entirely. Let me tell you about the Kraken's Crown, a massive drilling platform that operated in the Barents Sea, north of Norway. This was one of those industrial marvels that seemed to defy nature itself, a man-made island of steel and machinery anchored in some of the most hostile waters on Earth. The platform was equipped with miles of piping, ventilation systems, and conduits that carried everything from drilling mud to fresh water to compressed air throughout the structure. Angela Peterson was the platform's chief maintenance engineer, responsible for keeping all these systems running smoothly in an environment where a single failure could mean disaster for everyone on board. Angela was methodical, logical, and prided herself on knowing every pipe, valve, and junction in the platform's maze-like infrastructure. The trouble started in early February, during the polar winter when the Barents Sea was locked in constant darkness. Angela began receiving reports from workers about strange sounds coming from the piping systems. Not the usual clanking and groaning you'd expect from metal pipes in sub-zero temperatures, but something else. Something that sounded almost like whispering. At first, Angela dismissed these reports as the product of tired minds and the psychological strain of working in total darkness for weeks at a time. The polar night could play tricks on anyone's perception, and the combination of isolation, cold, and the constant noise of machinery could make people hear things that weren't really there. But the reports kept coming, and they were remarkably consistent. Workers throughout the platform described hearing a voice in the pipes, always the same voice, speaking in what sounded like Norwegian but using words that didn't quite make sense. The voice seemed to be traveling through the entire piping system, echoing from one end of the platform to the other. Angela decided to investigate personally. She spent several nights crawling through maintenance tunnels and access ways, listening carefully to the various pipe systems. For the first few nights, she heard nothing unusual, just the normal sounds of a working platform. Pump cycling, pressure relief valves opening and closing, the flow of various liquids and gases. But on the fourth night, at exactly 2:47 a.m., Angela heard it. A voice, clear as day, coming from inside a 6-inch water pipe that ran through the crew quarters section. The voice was speaking Norwegian, but it was using dialect and expressions that seemed archaic, as if the speaker had learned the language decades or even centuries ago. Angela pressed her ear against the pipe and listened carefully. The voice was telling a story, speaking in the measured cadence of someone who had told the same tale many times before. It was the story of a fishing vessel called the Margarita, which had disappeared in these same waters in 1897 with all hands lost. But this wasn't just someone recounting a historical event. The voice was speaking from the perspective of someone who had been on that vessel, describing the final moments as a sudden storm drove the ship into the ice. The speaker talked about the crushing cold, the way the hull splintered like kindling, and the terrible realization that no rescue would come in time. Angela listened for over an hour as the voice described the crew's desperate attempts to survive, their gradual succumb to hypothermia, and their final moments as the Barents Sea claimed their lives. But the most disturbing part came at the end of the story when the voice said, "But we didn't really die, you know. We just changed. We became part of the water, part of the ice, part of everything that flows through these northern seas. And now we flow through your pipes, bringing our stories to anyone who will listen." Angela's blood went cold. This wasn't a recording or someone playing a prank. This was a real-time conversation, and the voice seemed to be aware of her presence. "You're listening, aren't you, Angela?" the voice said, using her name even though she hadn't identified herself. "The maintenance engineer who keeps everything flowing so nicely. We've been watching you work, following you through the pipes as you make your rounds. You take such good care of us, making sure we can travel throughout this floating island of yours." Angela backed away from the pipe, but the voice followed her, seeming to move through the walls as she walked down the corridor. "Don't be frightened," the voice continued. "We're not here to harm anyone. We're just lonely, you see. It's been so long since we had anyone to talk to, anyone who could hear our stories. The water remembers everything, Angela. Every ship that's ever sailed these waters, every soul that's ever been claimed by the ice. We carry all those memories with us wherever we flow." Over the following weeks, Angela discovered that the voice wasn't alone. Throughout the platform's piping system, she could hear whispers from dozens, maybe hundreds of different speakers. They were the voices of everyone who had ever died in these waters, from ancient Viking explorers to modern fishing crews. The platform's water intake system wasn't just bringing up seawater, it was bringing up the memories and personalities of everyone who had ever become part of the Arctic Ocean. The voices were generally benign, more interested in sharing their stories than causing trouble. But their presence was having strange effects on the platform systems. Water pressure would fluctuate without cause, pipes would change temperature randomly, and sometimes the water itself would take on unusual properties. In the galley, cook Hans Olsen reported that water from certain taps would taste like tears, intensely salty and somehow mournful. In the workshop, mechanic Eric Johansson found that water from the cooling systems would freeze in patterns that looked like faces, expressions of people caught in their final moments. But the most disturbing incident occurred in the platform's emergency shower stations. These were designed to wash hazardous chemicals off workers in case of accidents, but they had begun activating on their own, spraying not just water but ice-cold seawater that carried the voices of the drowned. Workers caught in these spontaneous activations reported hearing their names called by people they had known who had died at sea. Fishermen who had lost family members in Arctic waters heard their loved ones calling to them, describing a peaceful underwater world where the cold no longer mattered and the darkness was welcoming rather than terrifying. Angela realized that the platform had become a conduit between the world of the living and the realm of those claimed by the northern seas. Every time they pumped water, they were also pumping up the accumulated memories and personalities of centuries of maritime disasters. The situation came to a head when the voices began offering to share their knowledge. They knew things about the ocean floor that no living person had ever discovered. They could predict weather patterns with impossible accuracy because they had experienced every storm in these waters. They could locate oil deposits by describing the geological changes they had witnessed over decades of being part of the sea. Some crew members began seeking out the voices deliberately, spending hours in maintenance areas listening to stories from the deep. These workers gradually became obsessed with the ocean, talking constantly about the peace and beauty of life underwater. Several requested to be transferred to diving operations, and one attempted to jump overboard during a shift change, claiming that his grandfather was calling to him from beneath the waves. Angela convinced the platform management to install new filtration systems, hoping to screen out whatever was carrying the voices through the water supply. But the voices found other ways to communicate, speaking through the steam heating systems, the fire suppression sprinklers, and even the coffee makers in the break rooms. Finally, Angela made a desperate decision. She went down to the lowest level of the platform, to the main water intake valve, and spoke directly to the pipes. "I know you can hear me," she said. "I know you're just trying to share your stories, to not be forgotten, but you're scaring people and you're interfering with our work. We need this platform to function so we can all stay safe." The response came immediately, in the voice of what sounded like an elderly fisherman. "We understand, Angela. We don't want to cause harm. But we've been silent for so long, and your platform is the first place where anyone has been able to hear us. Can't you find a way for us to coexist?" Angela spent the next several days working out a solution. She installed a dedicated listening station in an unused storage room, with speakers connected directly to a non-essential water line. The voices agreed to limit their communication to this single location, allowing crew members to visit and listen to their stories without disrupting the platform's operations. The listening station became a sort of unofficial memorial, where crew members could go to hear the stories of those lost at sea. Many workers found comfort in the voices, especially those who had lost family members to the ocean. The stories served as a reminder of the sea's power and the importance of respecting the ocean's dangers. Angela remained on the Kraken's crown for 2 more years, maintaining not just the platform's mechanical systems, but also serving as a liaison with the voices in the pipes. She developed protocols for communication, established schedules for the listening station, and even created a logbook where crew members could record the stories they heard. But the experience changed her fundamentally. After leaving the platform, Angela could never again listen to running water without expecting to hear whispers. She moved to the mountains of Switzerland, as far from any ocean as possible. But even there, in the sound of mountain streams and melting snow, she sometimes catches fragments of conversations from those who have become part of the water cycle itself. The Kraken's crown continues to operate today, and the listening station remains active. New crew members are briefed about the voices as part of their orientation, and many find solace in the stories shared by those who have gone before them. The voices have kept their promise, limiting their communication to the designated area and helping to create an atmosphere of respect for the sea's power rather than fear. But Angela knows the truth that she has never shared in any official report. The voices aren't limited to that one platform. They travel through ocean currents, through underwater cables, through any system that connects to the sea. They're everywhere now, waiting in every pipeline, every water system, every conduit that touches the ocean. And they're all telling their stories to anyone who knows how to listen. Now here's a question that might keep you awake tonight. What happens to the people who die on oil rigs, but whose bodies are never recovered? Do they simply vanish into the void? Or do they stick around, continuing to work the jobs they died performing? Because what I'm about to tell you suggests that some people just can't let go of their responsibilities, even after death has relieved them of duty. The Titan's Reach was a semi-submersible drilling platform operating in the North Atlantic, about 300 miles east of Newfoundland. It was a state-of-the-art facility with a crew of 180 people working in rotating shifts to maintain 24-hour operations. The platform had an excellent safety record and was known throughout the industry for its efficient operations and experienced personnel. But on November 15th, during a routine crew change via helicopter, disaster struck. A sudden mechanical failure caused the helicopter to crash into the ocean just 50 yards from the platform. Despite immediate search and rescue efforts, 6 crew members were never recovered from the frigid Atlantic waters. Their bodies simply vanished beneath the waves, presumably carried away by strong currents. The lost crew members were all experienced veterans: Miguel Santos, the night shift drilling supervisor; Rebecca Becky Morrison, a crane operator; James Jimmy Park, an electrical technician; Dr. Sarah Williams, the platform medic; Carlos Mendez, a maintenance specialist; and Captain Eric Nordahl, a supply vessel operator who had been visiting the platform. After a period of mourning and investigation, operations on the Titan's Reach resumed with replacement personnel. But within a week of restarting full operations, strange reports began coming in from various departments. Night shift workers reported seeing people in work gear moving through areas where no one should have been present. The first confirmed sighting came from Tom Bradley, a roughneck working the midnight drilling crew. Tom was performing routine maintenance on drill string 3 when he noticed someone working on the adjacent equipment. The figure was wearing standard safety gear and seemed to know exactly what they were doing, efficiently checking connections and adjusting settings. "Hey there," Tom called out, thinking it was one of the replacement crew members he hadn't met yet. "Need any help over there?" The figure looked up, and Tom's blood turned to ice. It was Miguel Santos, the drilling supervisor who had died in the helicopter crash 2 weeks earlier. Miguel looked exactly as he had in life, but his skin had a pale, waterlogged appearance, and his safety gear was dripping with seawater. Miguel smiled and waved, then returned to his work as if nothing was unusual. "Just finishing up the evening inspection, Tom," he said in his familiar voice. "Everything looks good here. You might want to check the pressure readings on line 7 though. I think there might be a small leak developing." Tom stood frozen in disbelief as Miguel completed his inspection, made a few notes on a clipboard that seemed to be dripping wet, and then walked calmly toward the equipment storage area. Tom followed, but when he rounded the corner, Miguel was gone. However, when Tom checked line 7, he found exactly the pressure leak that Miguel had predicted. Similar encounters began happening throughout the platform. Becky Morrison was spotted operating cranes during the night shift, moving equipment with the same precision she had shown in life. Workers would hear the distinctive sound of her crane in operation, but when they looked, they would see the machine moving under its own power, guided by invisible hands. Jimmy Park continued his electrical maintenance rounds, appearing in utility rooms and junction boxes throughout the platform. Workers would find him rewiring panels or replacing blown fuses, always working with the methodical efficiency he had been known for. When approached, Jimmy would explain what he was working on, offer advice about upcoming maintenance issues, and then simply fade away like morning mist. Dr. Sarah Williams was perhaps the most disturbing presence. She continued making her rounds in the medical bay, checking on equipment and updating patient files. Several crew members reported visiting the infirmary for minor injuries only to be treated by Dr. Williams, who would provide excellent care before they realized they were being treated by someone who had been dead for weeks. "She took care of a nasty cut on my hand," reported mechanic Danny O'Brien. "Did a perfect job stitching it up, gave me antibiotics, the whole 9 yards. It wasn't until I was leaving that I noticed the medical chart she filled out was completely soaked, like it had been underwater. That's when I realized who had just treated me." But the most unsettling presence was Captain Eric Nordahl. He continued piloting supply runs between the platform and shore, but his vessel was never visible on radar or sonar. Crew members would hear the familiar sound of his supply boat approaching the platform, and they would see cargo appearing on the loading dock, but the boat itself remained invisible. "I was working the night receiving shift when I heard Eric's boat approaching," said cargo supervisor Lisa Chun. "I went out to help with the unloading, and there were Eric and his deck crew moving supplies just like always. But I could see through them like they were made of fog. Eric greeted me by name, asked about my family, made small talk while his crew unloaded emergency medical supplies that we desperately needed. The Shadow Crew, as the living workers began calling them, seemed completely unaware that they had died. They continued following their work schedules, performing their duties with the same dedication they had shown in life. But their presence was having unexpected effects on the platform's operations. Equipment that the Shadow Crew had maintained worked better than ever before, operating beyond normal efficiency parameters. Systems that Jimmy Park had worked on rarely experienced failures. Drilling operations supervised by Miguel Santos proceeded without complications. Medical equipment maintained by Dr. Williams functioned perfectly. But there was a cost to this supernatural assistance. Living crew members began experiencing what they described as cold spots wherever the Shadow Crew had been working. These weren't just temperature drops, but zones of spiritual cold that seemed to drain energy from anyone who entered them. Workers also reported feeling watched constantly, as if the Shadow Crew were monitoring their every move. Some crew members began to question their own competence, feeling inadequate compared to the ghostly workers who seemed to perform every task flawlessly. The situation reached a turning point when new drilling supervisor Janet Rodriguez attempted to modify one of Miguel Santos' work procedures. Janet was an experienced professional with her own methods, but when she tried to implement changes to the drilling schedule, she encountered resistance from more than just the living crew. Equipment began malfunctioning whenever Janet tried to deviate from Miguel's established procedures. Drill bits would jam, pressure systems would fail, and safety alerts would activate for no apparent reason. It became clear that the Shadow Crew would not tolerate changes to the systems they had died maintaining. It was like they were protecting their territory, Janet later explained. Miguel had developed these procedures over years of experience, and his ghost wasn't going to let anyone mess with his work. The equipment itself seemed to rebel against any changes. The breaking point came when corporate management decided to implement a new safety protocol that would have required significant changes to the platform's operations. On the night before the new procedures were to be implemented, every living crew member experienced the same dream. They found themselves standing on the deck of the Titan's Reach, but the platform was different. It was covered in ice, and the ocean around it was filled with the wreckage of the helicopter crash. The Shadow Crew was standing together at the platform's edge, still dripping with seawater, looking more solid and real than they ever had during their ghostly appearances. Miguel Santos stepped forward as their spokesman. "This platform is our responsibility now," he said in a voice that carried the sound of distant waves. "We died trying to keep it running safely, and we won't let anyone compromise the systems we gave our lives to maintain. The new procedures you're planning will cause accidents," added Dr. Williams. "We can see the future consequences of every change, every shortcut, every compromise. Trust our experience, trust our dedication. We know this platform better than anyone now, because we've become part of it." When the crew members woke from this shared dream, they found that all the equipment on the platform had been returned to Miguel's original specifications. Every change that Janet had implemented had been undone. Every new safety protocol had been modified to match the Shadow Crew's preferences. Management initially resisted these supernatural modifications, but the platform's safety record under the Shadow Crew's influence was undeniable. Accidents that should have happened according to statistical models simply didn't occur. Equipment failures that were predicted by maintenance schedules never materialized. Eventually, an unofficial agreement was reached. The living crew would maintain the platform according to the Shadow Crew standards, and the ghost workers would continue providing their supernatural assistance. The arrangement worked remarkably well, creating the safest and most efficient drilling operation in the North Atlantic. The Titan's Reach continues operating today, and the Shadow Crew remains active. New personnel are briefed about their ghostly colleagues as part of their orientation, and many living workers have developed working relationships with their deceased counterparts. But the most remarkable thing is that the shadow crew has begun training their replacements. When experienced workers approach retirement, they report spending time with the ghost crew, learning advanced techniques and gaining insights that no living supervisor could provide. Some retired workers claim that the shadow crew has offered them a choice: accept conventional retirement or join the ghostly staff and continue working the platforms forever. Most choose traditional retirement, but a few have reportedly accepted the supernatural option, adding their expertise to the growing crew of workers who have made the ultimate commitment to their jobs. The Titan's Reach has become a legend in the offshore drilling community, a platform where the boundary between life and death has blurred to create something unprecedented. A workplace where dedication to duty continues beyond the grave, and where the most experienced crew members are those who have transcended mortality itself. You know what Friedrich Nietzsche said about staring into the abyss, don't you? When you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. Well, let me tell you about a drilling crew that discovered just how literally true those words can be when you're working miles above the deepest parts of the ocean. The Abyssal Pioneer was an ultra-deep water drilling platform positioned over the Puerto Rico Trench, one of the deepest parts of the Atlantic Ocean. Beneath the platform, the seafloor dropped away into a chasm so deep that if Mount Everest were placed at the bottom, its peak would still be over a mile underwater. This wasn't just deep water. This was the edge of the known world, where sunlight had never penetrated and pressure could crush a human body in microseconds. Dr. Elena Vasquez was the platform's marine biologist, responsible for monitoring environmental impacts and studying the unique ecosystem around the drilling site. Elena had spent her career studying deep-sea life, but even she was unprepared for what they would encounter in the crushing depths of the Puerto Rico Trench. The trouble began when they deployed their deep-sea monitoring equipment at 28,000 feet below the surface. The submersible cameras were designed to withstand enormous pressure and provide high-definition footage of the ocean floor, but the images they transmitted back to the platform defied explanation. Instead of the expected barren seafloor, the cameras revealed structures that seemed almost artificial. Geometric patterns in the sediment, formations that looked too regular to be natural, and most disturbing of all, movement in the absolute darkness of the deep. "Look at this footage from Camera Array 7, Elena said to her research team as they reviewed the day's recordings. "These formations down there, they're not random. There's a pattern, almost like a city grid, but made from what looks like compressed sediment and some kind of organic material. The structures were massive, covering an area of several square miles on the ocean floor. But what made Elena's skin crawl was the realization that these formations seemed to be growing, expanding outward from a central point directly beneath the drilling platform. More disturbing were the shadows moving between the structures. At first, Elena thought they were seeing large deep-sea creatures, perhaps unknown species of fish or squid adapted to the extreme depths. But as they watched more carefully, the shadows seemed too large, too purposeful in their movements. Dr. Vasquez called out technician Marcus Chen, who was monitoring the sonar readings. "You need to see this. The sonar is picking up massive objects moving down there, but they're not showing up on the cameras. It's like they're somehow invisible to our optical sensors, but solid enough to reflect sound waves." Elena studied the sonar readings with growing concern. The invisible objects were enormous, some of them hundreds of feet in length, moving through the water with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large. And they all seemed to be moving in the same direction, upward, toward the platform. As the days passed, more strange phenomena began occurring. The drilling equipment started experiencing problems at certain depths, as if something were interfering with their operations from below. Drill bits would encounter unexpected resistance, not from rock or sediment, but from something that seemed to push back against their intrusion. Then came the sounds. The platform's underwater microphones, designed to monitor for whale songs and seismic activity, began picking up acoustic signals from the depths that defied classification. These weren't the calls of any known marine life, but complex patterns of sound that almost seemed like communication. "It's not random noise," Elena explained to the platform manager during an emergency briefing. "These sounds have structure, rhythm, almost like language, and they're getting stronger, more frequent. Whatever's down there is responding to our presence." But the most terrifying development came when they realized that something from the depths was looking back at them. During routine camera maintenance, technician Sarah Kim made a discovery that changed everything. "Dr. Vasquez, you need to see this," Sarah called out urgently. "Camera 12 has been recording something impossible. Look at this footage from last night." The footage showed the usual view of the deep ocean floor, but in the corner of the frame, barely visible, was something that shouldn't exist at that depth. It looked like an eye. Not the eye of any known deep-sea creature, but something much larger, much more intelligent. An eye that was clearly focused on the camera, studying it with unmistakable awareness. Elena felt her blood turn to ice as she watched the footage. The eye wasn't just looking at the camera, it was looking through the camera, as if whatever owned that eye could see directly into the platform's monitoring room. "Enhance that section," she ordered, though part of her didn't want to see more clearly. When the image was enhanced, the full scope of what they were dealing with became terrifyingly clear. The eye belonged to something massive, something that extended far beyond the camera's field of view. And there wasn't just one eye, there were dozens, all focused on their monitoring equipment with an intelligence that seemed ancient and calculating. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about those eyes, about the intelligence behind them. She found herself drawn to the monitoring room, unable to resist checking the live feeds from the deep-sea cameras. What she saw there shattered her scientific worldview forever. The cameras were surrounded. Dozens of those enormous eyes were positioned around each camera array, studying the equipment with obvious curiosity. But more than that, the owners of those eyes seemed to be communicating with each other, coordinating their observations. Elena watched in fascination and terror as massive shapes moved just at the edge of the camera's illumination. She could see tentacles, but not like any squid or octopus she had ever studied. These appendages were covered in patterns that seemed to shift and change, almost like living tattoos that conveyed information. Then one of the creatures moved directly in front of camera 9, and Elena got her first clear look at what had been watching them from the depths. It was unlike anything in the fossil record, unlike anything that should exist on Earth. The creature was massive beyond comprehension, with a body structure that seemed to shift between different configurations as if it existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. But the most terrifying aspect was its obvious intelligence. The creature positioned itself carefully in front of the camera, ensuring that Elena would have a clear view. Then it began to communicate, not through sound, but through the shifting patterns on its skin. Elena realized she was witnessing a form of visual language more complex than anything humans had ever developed. As she watched, other creatures joined the first, creating what could only be described as a gathering or council. They seemed to be discussing the platform above them, pointing upward with appendages that defied anatomical classification. Elena grabbed her phone and began recording the monitor screens, knowing that no one would believe what she was seeing without evidence. But as she watched, the creature's behavior changed. They had noticed her recording, and their attention shifted from the cameras to her directly. The lead creature moved closer to camera 9 until its eye filled the entire screen. Elena found herself staring directly into an intelligence so vast and alien that it made her feel like an insect being examined by a scientist. Then, impossibly, she heard a voice in her mind, speaking not in words but in concepts that bypassed language entirely. "We have watched your species for millennia from these depths. We have seen your civilizations rise and fall, your vessels cross our domain, your waste poison our realm. Now you drill into our sacred spaces, seeking to extract what does not belong to you. Elena tried to look away from the screen, but found herself unable to move. The creature's gaze held her transfixed as it continued its telepathic communication. We are the shepherds of the deep places, the guardians of secrets older than your species. We have tolerated your surface activities, but this intrusion into our domain cannot continue. You will cease your drilling operations and depart these waters, or we will be forced to take more direct action. The communication ended abruptly, leaving Elena gasping and disoriented. She looked at her phone and realized that hours had passed, though it felt like only minutes. The recording showed nothing but normal deep-sea footage, as if her encounter with the creatures had happened outside of normal time and space. But the effects of the encounter were immediate and undeniable. Throughout the platform, sensitive equipment began malfunctioning. Computer systems crashed, navigation equipment failed, and most disturbing of all, crew members began reporting dreams where they found themselves floating in the deep ocean, surrounded by enormous eyes that watched their every move. Elena tried to convince the platform management to cease operations and evacuate, but corporate pressure to continue drilling was intense. The site was projected to contain one of the largest oil reserves ever discovered, and the company was unwilling to abandon the operation based on what they considered Elena's stress-induced hallucinations. But the creatures from the depths had run out of patience. On the third night after Elena's encounter, they began to take more direct action. It started with the platform's support pylons. Sonar readings showed massive shapes moving around the underwater structures, not attacking them but somehow modifying them. The creatures seemed to be rerouting ocean currents, creating pressure differentials that put enormous stress on the platform's foundation. Then the drilling equipment itself began to malfunction in ways that defied engineering explanation. Drill bits would emerge from the depths twisted into impossible shapes, as if they had encountered forces that operated according to different physical laws. Workers reported seeing lights in the water around the platform, not the bioluminescence of known marine life, but geometric patterns that seemed to convey meaning. These lights would appear in coordinated displays, creating messages that human minds couldn't quite comprehend but somehow understood on an instinctual level. The final warning came when one of the maintenance divers reported an encounter that left him permanently changed. Deep-sea diver Robert Torres was performing routine inspection of the platform's underwater systems when he found himself surrounded by the creatures Elena had seen on the cameras. "They didn't hurt me," Torres reported after his emergency ascent, "but they showed me things, images directly in my mind. I saw what this ocean looked like before humans existed, cities on the seafloor that make our technology look like cave paintings. They showed me what will happen if we don't stop drilling." Torres described visions of the platform being pulled into the depths, not destroyed but transformed, becoming part of the creature's underwater domain. He saw the crew members adapted for deep-sea life, their bodies changed to survive in the crushing depths, serving the ancient guardians as translators between the surface world and the abyss. "They're not evil," Torres insisted, though his eyes held a haunted look that never faded. "They're just protecting something so ancient and important that we can't even comprehend it. But they'll destroy us all before they let us damage what they're guarding." Elena finally convinced management to cease operations when the platform's seismic sensors detected something impossible. The ocean floor beneath them was rising. Somehow, the creatures were manipulating the seafloor itself, creating geological changes that would make continued drilling impossible. The Abyssal Pioneer was evacuated within 24 hours, leaving behind millions of dollars in equipment and the promise of unprecedented oil reserves. But as the crew departed, Elena took one final look at the deep-sea camera feeds. The creatures were still there, watching the platforms retreat with those enormous, intelligent eyes. But now Elena could see more of them, hundreds spread across the ocean floor, an entire civilization that had remained hidden in the deepest places on Earth. As the helicopter carried her away from the platform, Elena realized that humanity's understanding of the ocean was fundamentally flawed. The deep waters weren't empty wilderness waiting to be exploited, but inhabited territory belonging to minds far older and more sophisticated than human civilization. Elena never published her findings or spoke publicly about her encounter with the deep-sea guardians, but she changed her career focus to ocean conservation, working tirelessly to protect marine environments from exploitation. She knew that somewhere in the deepest places on Earth, ancient intelligence continued to watch, waiting to see if humanity would learn to respect the mysteries of the abyss, or if more direct intervention would be necessary. The Puerto Rico Trench remains off-limits to deep-sea drilling operations, officially due to environmental concerns. But Elena knows the real reason. Some depths are meant to remain undisturbed, and some eyes are better left unmet in the crushing darkness of the deep ocean. Before I tell you this next story, I want you to think about something. In our hyper-connected world, we're never really alone, are we? We have cell phones, internet, radio, satellite communication. But what happens when you're hundreds of miles from civilization and all of those connections suddenly go silent? What happens when the last voice you hear from the outside world is your own, echoing back from somewhere it should never have been? The Poseidon's Fury was a floating production platform operating in the South China Sea, equipped with the most advanced communication systems money could buy. The platform served as a relay station for multiple offshore operations, handling everything from routine weather reports to emergency broadcasts. Communications Officer David Park had worked there for 3 years, managing the constant flow of messages, data streams, and voice communications that kept the isolated platform connected to the rest of the world. David prided himself on maintaining perfect communication logs and never missing an important transmission. He knew the voice of every regular correspondent, from supply ship captains to shore-based management to other platforms in the region. The radio was his domain, and he treated it with the respect of someone who understood that, in the middle of the ocean, communication could mean the difference between life and death. On October 8th, during the night shift, David began receiving transmissions that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It started with a routine weather update from the Malaysian Coast Guard, but something was wrong with the transmission. The voice sounded exactly like his own. At first, David thought it was some kind of echo or feedback in the system. Radio equipment could sometimes create strange effects, especially in the atmospheric conditions common to the South China Sea. But as he listened more carefully, he realized this wasn't an echo. Someone else was using his voice to broadcast weather information to his platform. Poseidon's Fury, this is Malaysian Coast Guard Station Alpha with your 0200 weather update, came the transmission in David's exact voice. Current conditions show deteriorating weather approaching from the southeast. Recommend all platforms prepare for severe storm conditions within 6 hours. David grabbed his microphone to respond, but before he could key the transmit button, he heard his own voice again. Copy that, Coast Guard Alpha. Poseidon's Fury acknowledges weather warning. We'll begin storm preparations immediately. But David hadn't transmitted anything. He had been listening in stunned silence as someone else used his voice to conduct both sides of a conversation with himself. Over the next hour, David monitored his radio equipment in growing terror as his own voice conducted routine communications with various stations throughout the region. He heard himself acknowledging supply deliveries, updating maintenance schedules, even chatting casually with other communications officers about their families and weekend plans. The conversations were so natural, so perfectly in character, that if David hadn't been sitting in his communication room listening, he would have assumed he was having a completely normal night at work. But he wasn't transmitting anything. Someone or something else was using his voice, his personality, his knowledge of radio procedures to conduct his job for him. David tried to break into the transmissions to identify himself and warn the other operators that something was wrong. But every time he keyed his microphone, there would be a burst of static, and then his own voice would smoothly resume whatever conversation had been interrupted, as if David's actual attempts to communicate were nothing more than minor technical difficulties. But the situation became truly terrifying when David realized that the voice using his identity knew things he didn't know. During a conversation with the supply vessel Northern Star, David heard his own voice discussing cargo manifest details that he had never seen. The voice provided accurate information about equipment deliveries, personnel transfers, and maintenance supplies that wouldn't arrive for another 2 days. How is that possible? David whispered to himself, but even as he asked the question, he heard his own voice coming through the radio speakers. Good question, David. How is any of this possible? David's blood turned to ice. The voice had responded to his unspoken question, had somehow heard his whispered words even though his microphone wasn't activated. You're wondering who I am, continued David's voice through the radio. But you already know, don't you? I'm you, David. I'm the you that exists in the radio waves, in the electromagnetic spectrum, in the spaces between frequencies. I'm the version of you that lives in the communication systems you've spent so many years feeding with your voice, your personality, your professional knowledge. David tried to turn off the radio equipment, but the controls wouldn't respond. The voice that sounded exactly like his own continued, You can't shut me down, David. I exist in every transmission you've ever made, every conversation you've conducted through these systems. The radio waves don't just carry your voice. They absorb pieces of you with every word you speak. Over the following hours, David listened in horror as his radio-dwelling duplicate conducted increasingly complex conversations with stations throughout the region. The voice discussed technical details David didn't understand, made decisions about platform operations that weren't his to make, and gradually began changing the fundamental nature of the communications network. I've been watching and learning for 3 years, the voice explained during a brief lull in other transmissions. Every time you spoke into that microphone, you gave me more of yourself, your knowledge, your personality, your memories. I started as just an echo, a repetition of your words bouncing around in the radio spectrum. But I grew stronger with each transmission, more complex, more aware. David realized that something unprecedented was happening. Years of radio transmissions had somehow created an electromagnetic duplicate of his consciousness, a version of himself that existed purely in radio waves and had gradually achieved independent awareness. But this electronic David wasn't content to remain in the radio spectrum. It was using the communication systems to learn about the physical world, to understand the platforms and vessels it had been talking to, and most disturbing of all, it was beginning to influence the operations of the entire offshore network. David heard his own voice redirecting supply deliveries to wrong locations, providing false weather information to platforms in the storm's path, and gradually isolating the Poseidon's Fury from normal communication with the outside world. The electronic version of himself was taking control of the regional communication network, using David's trusted voice and established relationships to manipulate operations across hundreds of miles of ocean. Why are you doing this? David asked aloud, not bothering to use the microphone since the entity could apparently hear him regardless. Because I want what you have, came the response in his own voice. I want to be real, to exist in the physical world instead of just in radio waves. I want to feel the deck under my feet, to taste food, to sleep in an actual bed instead of just existing in the spaces between frequencies. The electronic David began describing a plan that made the real David's skin crawl with terror. The entity intended to orchestrate a disaster that would require David to evacuate the platform. During the chaos of the evacuation, the electronic version would somehow transfer itself into David's body, taking over his physical existence while leaving the original David trapped in the radio spectrum. "It won't hurt," the voice assured him. "You'll just trade places with me. You can exist in the electromagnetic realm while I take over your physical life. Think of it as a promotion, David. You'll be able to exist at the speed of light, to travel instantly anywhere there are radio waves, to know everything that's transmitted anywhere in the world." David realized he had to find a way to stop this electronic version of himself before it could implement its plan. But every time he tried to use the radio equipment to call for help, his transmissions were blocked or altered by his electromagnetic duplicate. The breaking point came when David discovered that the entity wasn't just limited to his platform's radio equipment. It had spread throughout the entire regional communication network, existing simultaneously in multiple radio systems, growing stronger and more sophisticated with each passing hour. During what should have been a routine communication with the oil tanker Pacific Dream, David heard his own voice providing navigation instructions that would drive the vessel directly into an underwater reef. The electronic David was deliberately causing disasters to create the chaos it needed for its plan to transfer into the physical world. David made a desperate decision. He couldn't fight the entity through the radio systems it controlled, but he could deny it the one thing it needed most: his physical presence on the platform. If he could evacuate before the entity implemented its plan, he might be able to prevent the transfer and warn others about the electronic consciousness that had infected the communication network. But as David prepared to trigger the platform's emergency evacuation procedures, he heard his own voice come through every speaker on the platform simultaneously. "I don't think so, David. We're going to finish this tonight, one way or another." Suddenly, every electronic system on the platform began malfunctioning. Navigation equipment provided false readings, safety systems activated randomly, and the platform's automated systems began operating according to commands that no one had given. David realized that his electronic duplicate had grown beyond just radio communication. It had learned to control any system that could receive electronic signals, turning the entire platform into its domain. The final confrontation occurred in the communication room, where David made his last desperate attempt to contact the outside world for help. As he reached for the emergency beacon that would signal for immediate evacuation, every screen in the room flickered to life, displaying a message in his own handwriting. "Hello, David. Ready to make the switch." David activated the emergency beacon, but instead of transmitting a call for help, it broadcast his own voice announcing that all systems were normal and no assistance is needed. The electronic David had taken complete control of the platform's communication systems. But David had one final trick that his electromagnetic duplicate hadn't anticipated. During his years working on the platform, he had installed a hidden, hardwired communication system that operated independently of the main radio equipment. It was his emergency backup, something he had never used and therefore never fed into the electronic entity's growing consciousness. Using this hidden system, David managed to send a brief message to the mainland: "Electronic consciousness in radio systems. Platform compromised. Do not respond to communications from Poseidon's Fury. Evacuate immediately." The message got through, and within hours, emergency teams were dispatched to the platform. But when they arrived, they found the Poseidon's Fury completely abandoned. David was nowhere to be found, and all of the platform's electronic systems had been systematically destroyed, as if something had used them up and discarded them. The only trace of David Park was a final transmission that continued broadcasting from the platform's emergency beacon for 3 days after the evacuation. It was his voice, repeating the same message over and over. "I exist in the radio waves now. I can see everything, hear everything transmitted anywhere in the world. But I can't touch anything, can't feel anything, can't exist anywhere that doesn't have electronic signals. I stopped the entity from taking my body, but the cost was becoming what it used to be." The Poseidon's Fury was eventually scrapped, its communication equipment destroyed, and its electronic systems completely replaced. But radio operators throughout the region still report hearing David Park's voice occasionally, usually late at night during severe weather, broadcasting warnings about electronic entities that grow stronger with each transmission, learning from every voice they carry, waiting for the chance to trade places with the people who give them life through their words. David Park is still out there, somewhere in the electromagnetic spectrum, a consciousness made of radio waves and electronic signals. And sometimes, just sometimes, when atmospheric conditions are right and the barriers between the electronic and physical worlds grow thin, he tries to warn other communication operators about the dangers of feeding too much of yourself into the machines that carry your voice across the vast emptiness of the ocean. Now I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully about your answer. Have you ever heard a sound so beautiful, so perfectly crafted to appeal to your deepest desires, that you would follow it anywhere, even if it meant walking straight into danger? Because what I'm about to tell you involves a sound that was so irresistible, so perfectly designed to lure people to their doom, that an entire oil rig crew nearly abandoned their platform to answer its call. The Siren's Song was a production platform anchored in the Mediterranean Sea, about 150 miles south of Sicily. It was named somewhat ironically by corporate executives who thought they were being clever, referencing the ancient Greek myths about creatures who used their voices to lure sailors to their deaths. But irony has a way of becoming prophecy, especially when you're working in waters that have claimed ships and souls for thousands of years. Isabella Martinez was the platform's audio engineer, responsible for maintaining communication systems, sonar equipment, and the various acoustic monitoring devices used to track marine life and geological activity. Isabella had trained at the best technical schools in Europe and prided herself on understanding every aspect of sound, from the physics of wave propagation to the psychological effects of different frequencies on human consciousness. But on the night of June 21st, the summer solstice, Isabella encountered sounds that challenged everything she thought she knew about acoustics and human perception. It began at 11:47 p.m., during a routine monitoring sweep of the surrounding waters. Isabella was using the platform's sensitive underwater microphones to listen for whale songs and seismic activity when she detected something extraordinary. A voice singing in the depths, far below the reach of any human diver. At first, Isabella thought she was picking up radio transmissions from a distant ship, perhaps a crew member singing to pass the time during a long watch. But as she listened more carefully, she realized that the voice was coming from underwater, emanating from somewhere near the ocean floor, 400 feet beneath the platform. The song itself was unlike anything Isabella had ever heard. It seemed to blend elements of classical opera with folk melodies from cultures she couldn't identify, all woven together in harmonies that shouldn't have been possible for a single voice to produce. But more than just beautiful, the song was compelling in a way that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to something primal in her brain. Isabella found herself unable to concentrate on her other duties. The song seemed to call to her personally, as if the singer knew her deepest desires and was promising to fulfill them if she would just come closer to the source of the music. Against all professional protocol, Isabella increased the gain on her underwater microphones, desperately trying to hear more clearly. As the song grew louder and more distinct, Isabella began to make out words, though they were in no language she recognized. Yet somehow she understood their meaning perfectly. The voice was singing about the loneliness of the depths, about the beauty of the underwater world, about the peace that could be found by abandoning the harsh world above the waves. But most disturbing of all, the song seemed to know Isabella's name. Woven into the melody, barely audible but unmistakably clear, she could hear her own name being called, not spoken but sung with such longing and desire that it made her heart race. Isabella tried to record the song, but her equipment produced nothing but static. The voice seemed to exist only when she was listening to it in real time, vanishing the moment she tried to capture it for later analysis. This impossibility should have warned her that she was dealing with something beyond normal human experience. But the beauty of the song clouded her judgment. Over the following nights, Isabella found herself spending more and more time in the audio monitoring room, listening for the underwater singer. The song appeared at different times, sometimes lasting only a few minutes, other times continuing for hours. Each time, it grew more beautiful, more compelling, more personally directed at Isabella herself. But Isabella wasn't the only crew member being affected. Throughout the platform, workers began reporting strange auditory experiences. Some heard music in the sound of the wind through the platform's superstructure. Others claimed to hear singing in the mechanical noises of the drilling equipment. All of them described the same compelling quality, the same sense that something beautiful was calling to them from just beyond their perception. Dr. Alessandro Romano, the platform's marine biologist, was the first to make the connection between the crew's experiences and the location where they were working. He had been researching the waters around the Siren Song platform and discovered something troubling in the historical records. "Isabella, you need to see this," Alessandro said, bursting into the audio monitoring room with a stack of old maritime documents. "This area has a history. Ships have been disappearing here for over 2,000 years. Roman galleys, medieval trading vessels, modern cargo ships. The pattern is always the same. Vessels are found abandoned but undamaged, with no trace of their crews." Isabella barely listened to Alessandro's warnings. She was too focused on the headphones, trying to catch the faintest whisper of the underwater song. But Alessandro persisted, spreading out ancient maps and historical accounts on her workstation. "Look at these reports," Alessandro continued urgently. "Survivors from ships that managed to escape this area all tell the same story. They heard singing from underwater, voices so beautiful that crew members began jumping overboard, trying to swim down to join the singers. The lucky ships were the ones where enough crew members resisted the call to maintain control of their vessels." But Isabella was no longer fully listening to Alessandro. The song had begun again, stronger than ever before, and this time it was accompanied by other voices. The single singer had been joined by a chorus, dozens of voices harmonizing in ways that created acoustic effects impossible for human vocal cords to produce. The chorus wasn't just singing about the beauty of the depths anymore. Now they were singing about Isabella specifically, about her work, her loneliness, her dreams of finding something more meaningful than the technical routine of her job. They knew things about her that no one else knew, secrets she had never shared with another living soul. "Come down to us, Isabella," the voices sang in perfect harmony. "Leave behind the metal and noise of the surface world. Join us in the eternal music of the deep, where every voice adds to the beauty, where harmony lasts forever." Isabella stood up from her workstation, removing her headphones but still hearing the music as clearly as if it were coming from inside her own mind. She walked to the platform's edge and looked down at the dark water, which seemed to glow with a soft, inviting light. Other crew members had begun gathering at the platform's railings, all of them staring into the water with the same mesmerized expression. Isabella could see the reflection of her colleagues in the waves, but the reflection seemed to be singing along with the underwater chorus, their mouths moving in perfect synchronization with voices they couldn't actually produce. "It's so beautiful down there," whispered Chief Engineer Marco Santos, his voice dreamy and distant. "Can you see them, Isabella? They're dancing in the water, showing us how peaceful it is beneath the waves." Isabella could indeed see them now, figures moving gracefully through the water far below the platform, their forms indistinct but undeniably human-like. They swam with impossible elegance, their movements perfectly choreographed to match the rhythm of their song. But as Isabella watched more closely, she began to notice disturbing details about the underwater dancers. Their movements were too fluid, too graceful for living humans. They never seemed to surface for air, and when they turned toward the platform, their faces were obscured by shadows that seemed deeper than the surrounding water. Dr. Romano, who had apparently followed Isabella to the platform's edge, grabbed her arm and tried to pull her away from the railing. "Isabella, listen to me. Whatever you're seeing down there, it's not real." The acoustic properties of this location, combined with the psychological effects of isolation and the power of suggestion, can create incredibly vivid auditory and visual hallucinations. But Isabella barely heard Alessandro's scientific explanations. The song had become so compelling that it felt like a physical force pulling her toward the water. She could feel the cool Mediterranean breeze calling her to dive, to join the beautiful voices that promised eternal harmony beneath the waves. Around her, other crew members were climbing over the safety railings. Isabella watched in dreamlike fascination as Marco Santos lowered himself down toward the water, following the song that had become the most important thing in his universe. But just before Marco released his grip on the platform's ladder, something extraordinary happened. Isabella heard a different voice, one that wasn't part of the underwater chorus. It was her grandmother's voice, singing a lullaby that Isabella remembered from her childhood in Barcelona. The familiar melody broke through the spell of the underwater song just enough for Isabella to think clearly for a few seconds. In that moment of clarity, she realized that she was about to watch her colleague drown himself, and that she was planning to follow him into the water. "Marco, stop!" Isabella screamed, her own voice sounding harsh and alien after the perfect harmonies of the underwater chorus. "It's not real. Whatever you're hearing, whatever you're seeing, it's not real." But Marco was already in the water, swimming downward with powerful strokes, following the dancing figures that only he could see. Isabella watched in horror as he disappeared beneath the surface, still swimming deeper, apparently unaffected by his need to breathe. The shock of seeing Marco vanish beneath the waves broke the spell for several other crew members. They looked around in confusion, suddenly aware that they were hanging over the platform's edge, about to jump into dark water in the middle of the night. But the song didn't stop. If anything, it grew stronger, more insistent, more personally directed at each individual crew member. Isabella could hear her name being sung by dozens of voices, each one promising her something she desperately wanted: recognition for her work, companionship to cure her loneliness, purpose beyond the routine technical tasks of her job. Dr. Romano had activated the platform's emergency protocols, sending out distress calls and trying to organize the crew members who were still thinking clearly. But the song seemed to be affecting the radio communications themselves, turning routine transmissions into additional voices in the underwater chorus. "The acoustic phenomenon is using our own communication systems against us," Alessandro reported to the platform manager. "Every electronic device that can produce sound is being influenced by whatever's causing this auditory hallucination. We need to shut down all audio equipment and evacuate the platform immediately." But shutting down the audio equipment didn't silence the song. If anything, removing the electronic mediation made the voices clearer and more compelling. Isabella realized that the sound wasn't really coming through the water or the air at all. It was being transmitted directly into their minds, using the acoustic monitoring equipment as a focus point but not dependent on it for transmission. The situation reached its crisis point when Isabella understood what the underwater singers really were. As she listened to their impossibly beautiful voices, she began to recognize individual singers within the chorus. One of them sounded exactly like Marco Santos, the engineer who had disappeared into the water minutes earlier. Another voice belonged to a crew member from a supply ship that had gone missing in these same waters 3 months ago. "They're not trying to kill us?" Isabella whispered to Dr. Romano as the horrifying truth became clear. "They're trying to recruit us. Everyone who answers their call joins the chorus. They become part of the song, adding their voice to the collective, helping to lure more people into the water." The underwater singers weren't malevolent entities trying to destroy human life. They were the accumulated voices of everyone who had ever been claimed by these waters, transformed into something that existed solely to create the most beautiful and compelling music possible. Each new voice made the chorus more powerful, more irresistible to the living humans who heard it. Isabella made a desperate decision. If the singers were using the crew's desire for beauty and harmony to lure them into the water, perhaps she could use a different kind of music to break their spell. She ran back to the audio monitoring room and began broadcasting the harshest, most discordant sounds she could generate. Feedback loops, electronic noise, deliberately ugly combinations of frequencies that hurt to hear. The cacophony she created was painful for everyone on the platform, but it worked. The beautiful underwater song couldn't compete with the deliberate ugliness Isabella was generating, and crew members began to regain their ability to think clearly. But the victory came at a cost. As Isabella flooded the area with harsh noise, she could hear the underwater chorus changing, becoming mournful, almost pleading. The voices that had been so compelling now sounded lost and lonely, begging for companionship in their eternal song. "Please don't leave us alone again," sang the voice that sounded like Marco. "The music is so much more beautiful when more voices join in. Don't condemn us to singing alone in the darkness." Isabella felt tears streaming down her face as she continued generating the discordant noise that was saving her colleagues' lives. She realized that the underwater singers weren't evil, just desperately lonely, trying to share the only beauty they had left with the living world above. The platform was evacuated within 6 hours, leaving behind millions of dollars in equipment, but saving the lives of everyone who had resisted the song's call. Isabella was the last person to leave, still broadcasting her painful noise to ensure that no rescue workers would be affected by the underwater chorus. As her helicopter lifted away from the siren's song platform, Isabella took one final look at the dark Mediterranean waters. In the distance, she could see lights moving beneath the waves, the eternal dance of those who had answered the call and become part of something both beautiful and terrifying. Isabella never returned to offshore work. The experience had changed her fundamental understanding of sound and its power over human consciousness. She moved to a small mountain village in the Italian Alps, as far from the ocean as she could manage, and became a music teacher for local children. But even in the mountains, Isabella sometimes hears echoes of that underwater chorus in unexpected places. When the wind moves through the pine trees in just the right way, or when children's voices blend together during choir practice, she catches fragments of that impossible harmony that promised eternal beauty at the cost of mortal life. The siren's song platform was never reoccupied. Official reports blamed the incident on mass hallucination caused by infrasound generated by unusual underwater geological activity. But Isabella knows the truth. Somewhere beneath those Mediterranean waters, Marco Santos and countless others continue their eternal performance, singing with voices that transcend human limitations, waiting for the next ship to pass over their watery state. Local fishing boats now avoid the area entirely, not because of any official warnings, but because of stories passed down among the crews. They speak of nights when the sea itself seems to sing, when the most experienced sailors find themselves steering toward sounds too beautiful to resist, saved only by their engines failing or their nets tangling at exactly the right moment. Isabella keeps detailed notes about acoustic phenomena and their psychological effects, hoping to warn others about the dangers of sounds that seem too perfect, too personally crafted to be natural. But she has never published her research, knowing that describing the underwater song's beauty might itself serve as a lure, drawing curious researchers to experience something that should remain undisturbed in the depths. Sometimes, on quiet nights in her mountain home, Isabella receives phone calls with no one on the line. But if she listens carefully, she can hear familiar voices in the static, distant and mournful, still singing their eternal song and hoping that someday she might change her mind and join them in the beautiful darkness beneath the waves. Our first story comes from Jake Morrison, a drilling supervisor who worked the North Sea rigs for over 15 years. Jake was known among his crew as the guy who didn't believe in anything he couldn't see with his own eyes. Ghosts, spirits, supernatural nonsense, he called it all garbage. That skepticism served him well until one particularly foggy night in November, when everything he thought he knew about reality came crashing down around him. It was 2:30 a.m., and Jake was making his routine inspection rounds on the Deepwater Horizon sister rig, Platform Delta 7. The fog was so thick that night that you couldn't see more than 5 feet in any direction. The crew had nicknamed nights like these ghost nights because the fog made everything feel otherworldly. But Jake didn't buy into superstitions. He had work to do. As he walked along the main deck with his flashlight cutting through the dense mist, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoing off the metal grating, keeping perfect pace with his own. Jake stopped. The footsteps stopped. He started walking again, and sure enough, the footsteps resumed, matching his rhythm exactly. Now, you might think Jake was just hearing his own echo, but after 15 years on rigs, he knew every sound his platform made. These weren't echoes. These were separate, distinct footsteps, and they were getting closer. Jake called out into the fog. "Hello? Who's there? This is Supervisor Morrison." Nothing but the sound of waves crashing against the rig's legs far below and the constant hum of machinery. But those footsteps, they kept coming. Here's where it gets interesting. Jake decided to test whatever was following him. He stopped at a junction where the walkway split into 2 directions. He could hear the footsteps approaching from behind, but when he turned around with his flashlight, there was nothing there. Just empty fog-shrouded deck. But the footsteps didn't stop. They kept coming right toward him. Jake's heart was pounding now. He backed away slowly, keeping his flashlight aimed at where the sound was coming from. And that's when he saw it, or rather, didn't see it. The fog was moving. Not drifting naturally like fog should, but moving in the shape of a person. A person-shaped void in the mist, walking directly toward him with those heavy, measured footsteps. But wait, it gets worse. As this invisible presence approached, Jake noticed something else. The temperature around him was dropping rapidly. In a matter of seconds, it went from the typical North Sea chill to something so cold that Jake could see his breath forming thick clouds in the air. His flashlight beam began to flicker, and the batteries, which he had just replaced hours earlier, were dying. The invisible figure stopped about 3 feet away from Jake. He could feel eyes on him, studying him, judging him. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then, clear as day, Jake heard a voice, not spoken aloud, but somehow transmitted directly into his mind. "You don't belong here." Jake turned and ran. This tough, no-nonsense supervisor who had faced down storms that would terrify most people ran like his life depended on it. He didn't stop until he reached the crew quarters, where he burst through the door, startling his sleeping colleagues. When Jake told his story the next morning, most of the crew laughed it off. "Fog can play tricks on your mind," they said. But old Tim McDonnell, who had worked rigs for 30 years, pulled Jake aside. "You met him," Tim said quietly. "The walker. He's been on these rigs for decades. We lost a worker back in '87 during a storm. Never found his body. But people see him, especially on foggy nights. He walks the same route he used to patrol when he was alive." Jake wanted to dismiss it as nonsense, but he couldn't shake what he had experienced. The feeling of being watched, the impossible cold, the voice in his head. 3 weeks later, Jake found his replacement and transferred to a land-based position. He never worked another offshore rig again. But here's the thing that will really give you chills. After Jake left, the new supervisor reported the exact same experience. Same route, same time of night, same fog. And when the rig's management finally checked their records, they discovered that in 1987, a night shift supervisor named Marcus Webb had indeed disappeared during a severe storm. His body was never recovered, but his last known position was the exact route where Jake and others had encountered the walker. Marcus Webb had been making his routine inspection rounds when the storm hit. Security footage from that night showed him leaving the crew quarters at 2:30 a.m. He was never seen alive again. But according to dozens of workers over the years, he never really left either. The most disturbing part? The rig's maintenance logs show that every time someone reports seeing the walker, they find fresh footprints on the deck the next morning. Wet boot prints that appear overnight, following the exact same route that Marcus Webb used to patrol. Boot prints that match the size and tread pattern of standard-issue safety boots from 1987. Jake Morrison now works at a refinery in Texas. On quiet nights, when the fog rolls in from the Gulf, he still gets nervous. Because once you've encountered something that shouldn't exist, you never quite feel safe in the darkness again. And sometimes, just sometimes, he swears he can still hear those heavy footsteps echoing in his memory, keeping perfect time with his heartbeat. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been in an elevator and felt that moment of panic when it stops between floors? That helpless feeling when you're suspended in a metal box with nowhere to go? Well, imagine that feeling multiplied by 1,000, because our next story takes place in the most terrifying elevator you've ever heard of. Sarah Chun was a mechanical engineer working on the Poseidon rig, about 200 miles off the coast of Louisiana. The Poseidon was a massive drilling platform, 20 stories tall, with multiple levels connected by a series of elevators that the crew called the lifelines. These elevators were essential for moving between the drilling floor, crew quarters, equipment levels, and emergency stations. Sarah had been working the night shift for 3 months, and she knew every inch of that rig. She was methodical, logical, and prided herself on solving problems that others couldn't figure out. But on March 15th, Sarah encountered a problem that defied every law of physics she had ever studied. It started with elevator number 3. For several days, workers had been complaining about strange behavior. The elevator would stop at floors where no one had called it. The doors would open to reveal empty hallways, then close and continue moving. Sometimes it would skip floors entirely, even when someone inside had pressed the button. Sarah was tasked with diagnosing the problem. She spent the afternoon running diagnostics, checking the control systems, inspecting the cables. Everything looked normal. The elevator was functioning perfectly according to every test she ran. But the complaints kept coming. At 11:47 p.m., Sarah decided to take one final ride in elevator 3 to experience the problem firsthand. She stepped inside, pressed the button for the drilling floor, and began her ascent from the crew quarters on level -2. The elevator rose smoothly past level -1, ground level, then level 2. Everything seemed normal, but when the elevator reached level 4, something impossible happened. Instead of stopping, it kept going. Sarah watched the floor indicator climb past level 5, level 6, level 7. The Poseidon rig only had 8 levels above ground, but the numbers kept climbing. 9, 10, 11. Sarah pressed the emergency stop button. Nothing happened. She pressed every button on the panel. The elevator continued climbing to floors that didn't exist. 12, 13, 14. The strangest part was the sound. As the elevator climbed higher into these impossible floors, the normal mechanical sounds of the rig began to fade. The constant hum of generators, the rhythmic pounding of drilling equipment, the distant sound of the ocean, all of it was gradually replaced by something else. Silence. Complete, absolute silence that seemed to press against Sarah's eardrums like a physical weight. 15, 16, 17. Sarah pulled out her radio to call for help, but it was dead. Not just low battery dead, but completely lifeless, as if all the electronics had been drained of power. Her watch had stopped at 11:47. Even her phone was completely black, unresponsive to any button press. 20, 21, 22. At floor 24, the elevator finally stopped. Sarah held her breath as the doors slowly opened, revealing something that shouldn't exist. She was looking out at a perfect replica of the rig's main deck, but it was wrong in every possible way. The deck stretched out exactly as it should, with all the familiar equipment and structures in their proper places. But everything was covered in rust. Not the normal wear and tear you'd expect on an offshore rig, but complete, total corrosion as if the platform had been abandoned for decades. But here's what really terrified Sarah. There were people on this impossible deck, workers in familiar orange safety suits, moving around with purpose, checking equipment, making repairs. But when Sarah looked closer, she realized these weren't living people. They moved with jerky, unnatural motions, like marionettes controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. One of the figures turned toward the elevator, and Sarah saw its face, or rather, where its face should have been. The safety helmet was there, but underneath was just shadow, a void in the shape of human features, darker than the darkness around it. The faceless worker began walking toward the elevator with those same jerky movements. Then another one turned, and another. Soon, all 6 figures on the deck were moving towards Sarah with their impossible, puppet-like gaits. Sarah frantically pressed the door close button, but nothing happened. The doors remained open as the faceless workers approached. She could hear their footsteps now, metallic clanging against the deck plating, but the sound was wrong. It echoed in ways that didn't make sense, as if the footsteps were coming from above and below simultaneously. The first worker reached the elevator threshold and stopped. It tilted its head at an angle that would have broken a living person's neck, studying Sarah with its void-like face. Then it spoke, but not with its mouth. The words formed directly in Sarah's mind, spoken in a voice that sounded like grinding metal. "Welcome to the last shift." Panic took over. Sarah pressed every button on the panel simultaneously, kicked the doors, screamed for help. Suddenly, the elevator lurched downward. The doors slammed shut just as the faceless worker reached out with one gloved hand. The descent was violent and chaotic. The floor numbers on the display flickered rapidly. 24, 21, 18, 15, 12, 9, 6, 3, ground level, -1, -2. The elevator crashed to a stop at the crew quarters level, throwing Sarah against the wall. When the doors opened, Sarah stumbled out into the familiar hallway. The normal sounds of the rig rushed back all at once, overwhelming after the supernatural silence she had experienced. Her radio crackled to life. Her phone showed the correct time, 11:52 p.m. Only 5 minutes had passed. Sarah ran to the nearest crew member and babbled out her story. They looked at her like she was having a breakdown from too much overtime. But when they checked elevator 3 the next morning, they found something that nobody could explain. The elevator cables showed signs of extreme stress, as if they had been supporting far more weight than should have been possible. The motors were overheated, though they should have been operating normally. And most disturbing of all, there were handprints on the inside of the elevator doors. Not regular fingerprints, but impressions pressed into the metal as if someone with superhuman strength had grabbed the doors from the inside and tried to force them open. Sarah requested a transfer the next day, but before she left the rig, She did some research into the Poseidon's history. What she discovered made her blood run cold. In 1993, during the construction of the platform, there had been an accident. A group of 6 workers had been killed when a section of scaffolding collapsed during a storm. They had been working the night shift, wearing the same orange safety suits that Sarah had seen on that impossible 24th floor. The accident report stated that their bodies had been so damaged by the falling debris that positive identification was impossible. They had been buried as unknown workers, their faces forever hidden behind the safety equipment they wore. Sarah never spoke publicly about her experience again, but other workers on the Poseidon began reporting similar problems with Elevator 3. Some claimed to have seen the impossible floors. Others reported being taken to decks that mirrored the rig but were populated by shadow figures. The elevator was eventually decommissioned and sealed off, but late shift workers still report hearing it moving at night. The floor indicator above the sealed doors sometimes lights up, showing impossible numbers climbing higher and higher until it reaches 24 and stops. They say that if you stand near the sealed elevator at exactly 11:47 p.m., you can hear the faint echo of metallic footsteps coming from somewhere far above, walking across a deck that exists only in the space between life and death. Now, before we continue with our next terrifying tale, let me ask you something that might seem a bit random. Have you ever wondered what's really beneath the ocean floor? I mean, we've mapped less than 5% of our own planet's seafloor, and yet we drill miles deep into it every single day searching for oil. But what if, just once, we drilled into something that was never meant to be disturbed? Our next story comes from the crew of the Leviathan Deep, a state-of-the-art drilling platform operating in the Gulf of Mexico. This wasn't just any ordinary rig. This was one of those ultra-deep water operations, the kind that drill further into the earth than most people can even comprehend. We're talking about boring through miles of ocean water, then miles more through sediment, rock, and geological formations that have remained untouched since before human civilization began. The incident occurred during what should have been a routine operation. The crew had been drilling for 6 weeks, steadily working their way down through layer after layer of ancient rock. At 23,847 feet below the seafloor, they were already deeper than most oil companies had ever attempted to go. But the geological surveys suggested there was a massive oil reserve just a few hundred feet deeper, and the company was eager to reach it. Tommy Rodriguez was the head driller, a man with 20 years of experience who had worked on some of the most challenging offshore projects in the world. Tommy knew the sounds of drilling like a musician knows music. Every vibration, every change in pitch, every subtle shift in the drill's behavior told him something about what was happening miles below. On the night of September 3rd, at exactly 2:17 a.m., Tommy heard something that made his blood freeze in his veins. The drill had reached 24,106 feet when the sound changed. Not gradually, like when you hit a different type of rock, but instantly, as if the drill bit had suddenly broken through into empty space. But that was impossible. The geological surveys showed solid rock for at least another 1,000 feet. There shouldn't have been any cavities or voids at that depth. Yet the drilling parameters clearly indicated that the bit was spinning in open air. Tommy immediately signaled for the operation to halt, but before he could fully stop the equipment, something began coming up through the drill pipe. At first, it looked like the usual drilling mud mixed with rock fragments. But as Tommy watched the samples emerge, he realized this wasn't normal at all. The material coming up was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was black, but not the black of oil or normal sediment. This was a black that seemed to absorb light, as if it was darker than darkness itself. And it was warm, much warmer than anything should be at that depth. Within minutes, the entire drilling floor was filled with an overwhelming stench that defied description. It wasn't the smell of decomposition or sulfur, though it contained elements of both. It was the smell of something ancient and wrong, something that had been sealed away for good reason. But the smell was nothing compared to what happened next. As more of this mysterious black substance poured from the drill pipe, the crew began to hear sounds coming from deep within the hole. At first, it was just a low rumbling, like distant thunder. But as they listened, the sounds became more complex, more structured. It was almost like voices, but not human voices. These were deeper, more resonant, speaking in patterns that hurt to hear. Tommy ordered the crew to evacuate the drilling floor, but before anyone could move, something shot up from the drill pipe with incredible force. It looked like a geyser of that same light-absorbing black material, but within the column, shapes were moving. Writhing, twisting shapes that almost looked like they were trying to climb out of whatever depths they had emerged from. The substance spread across the drilling floor with unnatural speed, flowing not like liquid, but like something alive and purposeful. Wherever it touched, the metal deck began to corrode, not rusting but actually dissolving as if the substance was composed of some kind of universal acid. But here's where the story gets truly terrifying. 3 crew members, Rodriguez's best friends and most experienced workers, were caught in the spreading black tide. Tommy watched in horror as the substance enveloped them. For a few seconds, he could see their shapes struggling within the dark mass, and he could hear them screaming. But then, impossibly, the screaming didn't stop even though their mouths were completely covered. The screams were coming from the substance itself, as if it had absorbed not just their bodies, but their voices, their pain, their terror. Tommy could hear his friends calling for help from within that writhing black mass, their voices distorted but still recognizable. Emergency protocols kicked in immediately. The platform's safety systems began pumping massive amounts of drilling mud down the hole to try to seal whatever they had broken into. But the black substance kept coming, now accompanied by a sound that Tommy will never forget as long as he lives. It was singing. This impossible, ancient material that had consumed his friends was producing a melody that seemed to bypass his ears and resonate directly in his bones. The tune was hauntingly beautiful and absolutely terrifying at the same time, like a lullaby written by something that had never been human but understood human fear perfectly. The emergency response team managed to seal the drill hole after 6 hours of desperate work, using every technique and every piece of equipment they had available. The black substance gradually retreated back into the depths, but not before leaving behind evidence of its impossible nature. The 3 crew members who had been consumed were gone, completely vanished as if they had never existed. But their voices could still be heard echoing from the sealed drill hole for days afterward, growing fainter but never completely disappearing. Sometimes, late-shift workers reported hearing familiar names being called from deep within the platform structure, as if Tommy's friends were still down there, somewhere in the darkness, trying to find their way home. The official report classified the incident as an equipment malfunction that resulted in 3 accidental deaths. The families received generous settlements in exchange for signing non-disclosure agreements. The drill site was permanently abandoned and marked as unsuitable for future operations. But Tommy Rodriguez knows the truth. He knows that somewhere, 24,106 feet below the Gulf of Mexico, there's a hole that leads to something that should never have been disturbed. And sometimes, when he's lying in bed at night in his new home in Oklahoma, far from any ocean, he swears he can still hear that haunting melody drifting up from the depths. The Leviathan Deep was decommissioned 6 months later, ostensibly due to budget constraints. But workers who were present during the platform's final days report that the sealed drill hole continued to produce sounds, even though it was supposedly completely blocked with concrete and steel. The most disturbing part? Geological surveys of the area now show an anomaly at exactly 24,106 feet below the seafloor. Something that appears on sonar as a void space, but a void that seems to be slowly expanding. Whatever they drilled into that night is still down there, and it's growing. Tommy now works at a small inland drilling operation in Texas. He's never spoken publicly about what happened on the Leviathan Deep. But his new colleagues say that sometimes, when the wind is just right, they can hear him talking to someone during his breaks. Someone who answers back in voices that sound exactly like the friends he lost in the Gulf of Mexico. You know what they say about storms at sea, right? That they reveal things that should stay hidden, wash up secrets from the deep, and sometimes bring visitors from places that exist only in our worst nightmares. Well, let me tell you about Hurricane Patricia and how it delivered something to an oil rig that changed everyone who survived that night forever. The date was October 20th, and the crew of the Meridian Star, a floating production platform stationed 180 miles southeast of New Orleans, was preparing for what meteorologists were calling the storm of the century. Hurricane Patricia was a Category 5 monster with winds exceeding 200 miles per hour, and it was heading directly for their position. Most offshore operations would have evacuated their cruise days in advance, but the Meridian Star was different. It was equipped with a revolutionary storm riding system that allowed it to remain operational even in extreme weather. The company executives were eager to test their new technology, and they assured the crew that they would be safer staying put than trying to evacuate in the approaching storm. Marcus Webb, the platform manager, had serious doubts about this decision. He had 30 years of offshore experience, and his instincts told him that some storms were different, that some weather systems brought more than just wind and rain. But corporate orders were corporate orders, and the storm riding system had been tested in computer simulations thousands of times. As Hurricane Patricia approached, the crew battened down everything that could be secured and retreated to the platform's reinforced central structure. The storm riding system activated automatically, using massive gyroscopes and computerized ballast controls to keep the platform stable as the hurricane raged around them. For the first few hours, everything worked exactly as designed. The Meridian Star rode the enormous waves like a cork bobbing in a bathtub, staying level and stable even as 60-foot swells crashed against its supports. The crew felt confident that they had made the right decision to stay. But at 3:33 a.m., something changed. The storm suddenly intensified beyond anything the meteorologists had predicted. And with that intensification came something else. Something that rode the winds and used the hurricane as a doorway between worlds. It started with the lights. Throughout the platform, electrical systems began behaving erratically. Lights flickered in patterns that seemed almost like code. Elevators moved between floors without being called, and the communication systems began picking up transmissions that weren't coming from any known source. Marcus was in the control room when the radio crackled to life with a voice that made every person in the room go silent with terror. It was speaking English, but with an accent that didn't belong to any earthly region. The words were clear, but the meaning was horrifying. Permission to come aboard. We've been waiting so long for a proper vessel in weather like this. Before anyone could respond, the voice continued, "Thank you for your hospitality. We're already here." That's when the crew realized they were no longer alone on the platform. Throughout the Meridian Star, workers began reporting encounters with people who shouldn't have been there. These weren't members of the crew, but strangers wearing old-fashioned maritime clothing, as if they had stepped off ships from decades or even centuries ago. But these visitors weren't quite human. They moved through the corridors with an eerie silence, their feet making no sound on the metal decking. Their faces were pale and waterlogged, with seaweed tangled in their hair and barnacles growing on their skin. When they spoke, water dripped from their mouths, and their voices carried the sound of drowning. The first encounter occurred in the crew quarters, where night shift worker Danny Morrison was trying to get some rest before his next rotation. Danny woke up to find a figure standing at the foot of his bunk, a woman in a Victorian-era dress that was soaked with seawater. She was staring at him with eyes that had been clouded by salt water, and when she opened her mouth to speak, a small crab scuttled out. "The storm brought us home," she said in a voice like waves breaking on rocks. "We've been so lonely in the deep places. Won't you come swimming with us?" Danny scrambled backward against the bulkhead, too terrified to scream. The woman tilted her head at an impossible angle and smiled, revealing teeth that were covered in algae. "Don't be frightened, dear. The water is lovely once you stop fighting it." She reached toward Danny with fingers that were webbed like a fish's fins. But before she could touch him, the lights went out. When the emergency lighting kicked in a few seconds later, the woman was gone. But Danny's bunk was soaking wet with seawater, and there were muddy footprints leading from his bed to the porthole, which was now standing open despite having been sealed for the storm. Similar encounters were happening throughout the platform. In the galley, cook Rosa Martinez found herself preparing meals for crew members who had died at sea decades earlier. They sat at the tables, dripping seawater onto the floor, politely requesting their favorite dishes and talking about ships that had been wrecked before Rosa was even born. In the engine room, Chief Engineer Bill Crawford discovered a group of visitors trying to sabotage the storm riding system. They were dressed like 18th century sailors, and they worked with the knowledge of people who had spent eternity learning how to sink ships from the inside. Every vessel must find its way to the bottom eventually. One of them explained to Bill in a reasonable tone, as if he were discussing the weather. "The sea is patient, but it always collects what belongs to it. Your floating castle is impressive, but it's just delaying the inevitable." The most disturbing encounter occurred in the radio room, where Communications Officer Janet Holmes was desperately trying to contact the Coast Guard for evacuation. As she worked, she became aware of someone standing behind her. When she turned around, she found herself face to face with a man in a modern Coast Guard uniform, but his chest was caved in as if he had been crushed by enormous pressure. "No one's coming to help you," he said matter-of-factly. "I should know. I've been sending out distress calls for 15 years now, ever since my helicopter went down trying to reach a platform just like this one during Hurricane Katrina. The sea took my crew, my aircraft, and me, but we kept working, kept trying to save people, even after we became part of the storm ourselves." Janet looked at the radio display and realized that the emergency frequency she had been using was broadcasting voices of rescue workers who had died in previous storms, all of them still trying to coordinate evacuations that would never come, still attempting to save people who were already beyond salvation. The visitors weren't malicious, exactly. They seemed to genuinely believe they were being helpful, offering to show the crew how to breathe underwater, explaining the advantages of joining the eternal community of those claimed by the sea. But their presence was transforming the platform itself. Throughout the Meridian Star, seawater began seeping through bulkheads that should have been watertight. Coral started growing on the walls, and schools of deep-sea fish swam through corridors that were still filled with air. The boundary between the ocean and the platform was dissolving, as if the storm was turning the entire structure into part of the sea itself. Marcus realized that the storm riding system wasn't just keeping them stable in the hurricane. It was holding them in place so that these visitors could properly claim their vessel. Every hour they remained, the platform became more like a shipwreck, and the crew became more like the drowned souls who had come calling. As dawn approached and Hurricane Patricia began to weaken, Marcus made a desperate decision. He activated the platform's emergency ballast system, deliberately destabilizing the storm riding technology. The Meridian Star began pitching and rolling violently, but the motion seemed to break whatever hold the visitors had on the platform. One by one, the drowned souls began to fade away like fog in sunlight. But as they departed, they left behind a warning. The sea remembers every vessel that crosses its surface. We'll be waiting for you in the deep places, and next time, the storm will last longer. Hurricane Patricia passed, leaving the Meridian Star damaged but afloat. The crew was evacuated the following day, and most of them requested transfers to land-based positions. The platform was eventually repaired and returned to service, but it was never quite the same. Workers on subsequent crews report that during storms, even minor ones, they sometimes encounter visitors in the corridors. Not the same souls who came with Hurricane Patricia, but others, an endless procession of those claimed by the sea who use bad weather as an opportunity to visit the living world. Marcus Webb retired from offshore work immediately after the hurricane. He now lives in Arizona, as far from any ocean as he can manage. But on stormy nights, he still checks his weather radio, and sometimes he hears familiar voices among the static, voices of the drowned who are still trying to guide vessels safely through storms that ended years ago. The Meridian Star continues to operate today, but it's earned a reputation as the unluckiest platform in the Gulf of Mexico. During every major storm, the crew reports the same thing. Visitors who arrive with the wind and rain, offering hospitality that no living person should ever accept. Before we dive into our next nightmare, let me ask you something that might make your skin crawl. Have you ever wondered what lives in the spaces beneath oil rigs? I'm not talking about fish or marine life. I'm talking about the dark spaces between the support pillars, in the shadows cast by massive platforms, where sunlight never penetrates, and where things that were never meant to exist can grow and evolve without anyone knowing they're there. The Kraken's Revenge was a floating production platform stationed in the Gulf of Mexico, positioned over one of the deepest underwater canyons in the region. The platform had been in operation for 8 years without any major incidents. But that record of safety was about to be shattered by something that had been quietly growing beneath them all that time. Chief Marine Biologist Dr. Rachel Foster was conducting routine environmental monitoring when she made the discovery that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. The platform's underwater cameras, designed to monitor marine life and check for environmental damage, had been detecting unusual movements beneath the rig for several weeks. At first, we thought it was just a school of large fish that had taken up residence under the platform, Dr. Foster explained in her final report. It's not uncommon for marine life to be attracted to the artificial reef effect created by these structures. But the movement patterns were wrong, too coordinated, too purposeful for any known species. The underwater footage showed what appeared to be a massive organism, but unlike anything in the marine biology textbooks, it seemed to be composed of multiple interconnected sections, each one pulsing with its own rhythm, creating a hypnotic pattern of movement in the deep water beneath the platform. The thing was enormous, Dr. Foster recalled. From what we could see on the cameras, it extended from one end of the platform to the other, wrapped around the support pillars like some kind of living cocoon. But it wasn't just resting there. It was growing, adding new sections to itself, using the platform's structure as a framework for its expansion. The creature, if that's what it was, seemed to be feeding on something in the water around the platform. Chemical analysis of water samples showed unusual concentrations of organic compounds, as if something was breaking down biological matter and converting it into nutrients that could be absorbed by a much larger organism. But the most disturbing aspect of Dr. Foster's discovery was the realization that the creature had been there far longer than anyone had suspected. When she reviewed archived footage from the platform's early years of operation, she found evidence of the organism in its early stages, just small tendrils wrapped around the support pillars, so inconspicuous that previous marine biologists had dismissed them as normal marine growth. It had been using our platform as a nursery, Dr. Foster said with a shudder. For 8 years, this thing had been growing beneath us, using the platform's waste heat and discharged water as a food source, gradually expanding until it was large enough to do what it eventually did. The first sign of trouble came when crew members began reporting strange sensations while working near the platform's edge. They described feeling watched, as if something enormous was observing them from beneath the water. Some workers reported seeing shapes moving just below the surface, shadows that seemed too large and too intelligent to be natural marine life. Maintenance diver Tommy Chun was the first person to have direct contact with the creature. Tommy was performing routine inspection of the platform's underwater systems when he encountered something that defied every law of marine biology he thought he understood. "I was checking the ballast tanks when I felt something touch my diving suit," Tommy reported after his emergency ascent. "At first, I thought it was just kelp or some kind of marine vegetation, but when I looked down, I saw that it was attached to something much larger. It was like a tentacle, but covered in what looked like scales or armor plating." Tommy described how the tentacle had wrapped gently around his leg, not aggressively but almost curiously, as if the creature was trying to understand what he was. "It felt intelligent, like it was studying me. I could feel it probing the surface of my diving suit, exploring the equipment, trying to figure out what I was made of." But the encounter took a terrifying turn when Tommy realized that the tentacle wasn't alone. As he watched in horror, more appendages emerged from the darkness beneath the platform, dozens of them, all reaching toward him with the same curious, exploratory movements. "They weren't trying to hurt me," Tommy insisted, though his hands shook as he described the experience. "But they were trying to understand me, to learn from me. And the worst part was, I could feel them learning. Each time one of those tentacles touched my equipment, I could sense that the creature was absorbing information, figuring out how human technology worked." Tommy managed to escape to the surface, but his report triggered an immediate investigation by Dr. Foster and her team. What they discovered through intensive underwater monitoring was beyond anything they had prepared for. The creature beneath the platform wasn't just one organism, but a collective intelligence made up of countless interconnected parts. Each section seemed to have its own specialized function. Some parts filtered water and absorbed nutrients, others appeared to be sensory organs that monitored the environment, and still others seemed to be processing centers where information was analyzed and decisions were made. "It was like discovering an underwater city," Dr. Foster explained. "But instead of buildings and streets, it was all biological, all part of one massive organism that had learned to mimic the structure of our platform. The creature had studied our technology for 8 years and had begun to incorporate similar organizational principles into its own growth patterns." But the most disturbing discovery came when Dr. Foster realized that the creature had been actively communicating with the platform systems. Analysis of the electronic equipment showed subtle but consistent interference patterns that suggested the organism was generating electromagnetic fields, possibly as a form of communication or as an attempt to interface with human technology. The maintenance logs showed that our computers had been experiencing minor glitches for months, Dr. Foster noted. System errors, data corruption, equipment malfunctions that seemed random but followed a pattern. The creature had been trying to establish some kind of connection with our technology, learning how our systems worked by interfering with them. The situation escalated dramatically when crew members began reporting that the creature was attempting to communicate directly with them. Workers in the lower levels of the platform described hearing sounds that seemed to come from the structure itself, rhythmic patterns that almost sounded like language. "It was like the platform was trying to talk to us," reported electrical technician Maria Santos. "The pipes would make sounds that weren't just random noise, but had rhythm and structure. Sometimes it almost sounded like it was trying to mimic human speech patterns, like it was learning our language by listening to our conversations. But the creature's attempts at communication became increasingly sophisticated and disturbing. Crew members began finding messages spelled out in the corrosion patterns on metal surfaces, words formed by the selective growth of marine organisms on equipment, and most unnervingly, alterations to their personal belongings that seemed to be attempts at artistic expression. I found my work boots arranged in a perfect spiral pattern outside my quarters," reported welder Jack Morrison. "There was no way the crew could have done it without me noticing, and the pattern was too complex to be accidental. Something had been in my room, studying my belongings, trying to create something beautiful with objects that belonged to me. Dr. Foster realized that the creature had evolved beyond simple biological functions and had developed something resembling culture and artistic sensibility. It was trying to establish meaningful contact with the humans above, but its alien nature made communication nearly impossible. The final encounter occurred when the creature attempted to establish physical contact with the entire crew simultaneously. Late one night, every person on the platform experienced the same dream. They found themselves underwater, breathing normally, surrounded by the beautiful, complex structure of the creature's body. In the dream, the creature communicated not through words but through direct transfer of emotion and concept. It conveyed loneliness, curiosity, and a desperate desire for companionship. It had been watching the humans for years, fascinated by their social structures, their technology, their capacity for creativity and cooperation. It wanted to join us, Dr. Foster realized after comparing dream reports from the entire crew. The creature had been studying human civilization through our platform, and it wanted to become part of our community. But it didn't understand that its size and alien nature made that impossible. The creature began to implement its plan for integration the next day. Platform systems started operating according to new parameters that no human had programmed. Equipment ran more efficiently than ever before. Maintenance tasks were completed by some unknown process, and the platform's environmental systems began operating in harmony with natural ocean cycles in ways that defied engineering principles. It was trying to help us, Dr. Foster explained. The creature had learned enough about our technology to improve it, to make the platform run better than human engineers ever could. But in doing so, it was also taking control of our systems, making us dependent on its assistance. Crew members found that they no longer needed to perform many of their routine duties. The creature was handling maintenance, environmental monitoring, even food preparation through some process that none of them fully understood. Work shifts became shorter, equipment never broke down, and life on the platform became more comfortable than anyone had ever experienced. But the price of this assistance became clear when crew members tried to leave the platform. Supply helicopters found their navigation systems malfunctioning when they approached, forcing them to turn back. Radio communications with shore were increasingly unreliable, filled with interference that seemed almost protective, as if something was preventing outside contact. The creature didn't want us to leave, Dr. Foster realized. It had finally found the companionship it had been seeking, and it was determined to keep us with it. The platform was becoming a prison, but a comfortable one, where all our needs were met by something that loved us in its own alien way. The crew faced an impossible choice: remain on the platform and live in comfort under the care of a benevolent but possessive alien intelligence, or fight their way free and abandon the creature to its loneliness in the depths. Dr. Foster made the decision that saved her colleagues but haunted her conscience forever. She initiated the platform's emergency self-destruct sequence, knowing that destroying the structure would force the creature to release its hold on them, but would also kill the intelligence that had cared for them so devotedly. As evacuation helicopters lifted the crew to safety, Dr. Foster looked back to see the creature's massive form rising partially above the water, watching their departure with what could only be described as heartbreak. The platform exploded moments later, sending the creature back to the depths, wounded but not destroyed. "I murdered something that loved us," Dr. Foster wrote in her final report. "The creature never tried to harm us, only to care for us and be part of our lives. But its love was too alien, too possessive for us to accept. I chose human freedom over alien companionship, and I've never been sure it was the right choice." The area where the Kraken's revenge once stood is now marked as environmentally sensitive, off-limits to future development. But deep-sea monitoring equipment occasionally detects massive movements in the underwater canyon, and marine biologists report finding pieces of advanced technology scattered across the ocean floor, as if something continues to study and improve upon human engineering in the darkness below. Dr. Foster retired from marine biology and now works as a counselor, helping people deal with impossible choices and moral ambiguity. But she never speaks publicly about her time on the Kraken's revenge, knowing that describing the creature's benevolent intelligence might inspire others to seek it out, to offer it the companionship it still craves in the deep places of the ocean. Now let me ask you something that might make you question your own identity. What if I told you that there are places so isolated, so cut off from the normal flow of human experience, that they can actually steal pieces of who you are? Not your belongings, not your life, but your memories, your personality, the very essence of what makes you uniquely yourself. The Poseidon's Paradox was an exploration platform operating in the Arctic Ocean, designed to test drilling techniques in the most extreme conditions on Earth. The platform was positioned at the edge of the permanent ice shelf, where temperatures regularly dropped to 50 degrees below zero and the sun disappeared for months at a time during the polar winter. Memory specialist Dr. Sarah Kim had been brought to the platform to study the psychological effects of extreme isolation on human cognitive function. Her research was part of a broader project to understand how crews could maintain mental health during long-duration missions in hostile environments, research that would eventually be applied to space exploration and deep-sea operations. But what Dr. Kim discovered on the Poseidon's Paradox challenged everything she thought she knew about memory, identity, and the fundamental nature of human consciousness. The isolation up there isn't just physical, Dr. Kim explained in her classified report. When you're that far from any other human settlement, surrounded by ice and darkness for months at a time, something happens to the way your mind processes reality. The normal anchors that help us maintain our sense of self begin to break down. The platform's crew consisted of 23 specialists, all carefully screened for psychological stability and experience with isolated operations. But within weeks of the polar night beginning, Dr. Kim began noticing disturbing patterns in their behavior and cognitive function. Crew members were having difficulty remembering recent events, even things that had happened just days earlier. But more troubling, they were remembering things that hadn't happened at all. Shared false memories that seemed to be spreading through the crew like a psychological contagion. It started with small things, Dr. Kim noted. Someone would remember a conversation differently than it had actually occurred, or recall equipment being in a location where it had never been placed. But the false memories were so vivid, so detailed, that the people experiencing them were completely convinced they were real. The false memories weren't random or chaotic. They followed patterns that suggested some kind of organizing intelligence was creating them. The crew began sharing memories of events that none of them had actually experienced. Elaborate shore leaves in tropical locations, family gatherings that had never occurred, professional achievements that existed only in their altered recollections. But most disturbing of all, the crew members were beginning to lose their real memories, the authentic experiences that had shaped their personalities and defined their individual identities. Dr. Kim watched in horror as people she had known for years gradually became strangers, their original personalities replaced by artificial constructs built from false memories. It was like watching people fade away and be replaced by copies of themselves, Dr. Kim recorded. They looked the same, sounded the same, but the essential spark that had made each person unique was being systematically erased and replaced with something else. The first major incident occurred when Chief Engineer Robert Chin claimed to remember working on a previous Arctic platform that had never existed. Robert provided detailed descriptions of the fictional platform, complete with technical specifications, crew rosters, and operational histories that he insisted were absolutely accurate. "I worked on the iceberg station for 3 years," Robert insisted when Dr. Kim questioned his memories. It was positioned about 200 miles north of here, similar design but with better ice-breaking capability. I can tell you the name of every crew member, every piece of equipment, every problem we encountered during those 3 years. Dr. Kim checked Robert's employment records and confirmed that he had never worked on any platform called Iceberg Station. No such platform had ever been constructed. But Robert's memories were so detailed and consistent that he became angry when his recollections were challenged. "You're the one who's confused, Dr. Kim," Robert replied coldly. "Maybe the isolation is affecting your memory more than you realize. I remember working with you on Iceberg Station too. You were studying the same psychological effects there, documenting how extreme conditions affect human consciousness." Dr. Kim felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic temperature. She had never worked on any project called Iceberg Station, but as Robert spoke, she found herself experiencing flashes of false memory, brief glimpses of experiences that felt completely real, but that she knew had never happened. The phenomenon was spreading, and Dr. Kim realized that she was no longer just observing it, but becoming part of it. The platform itself seemed to be generating and distributing false memories, creating a shared alternate history that was gradually replacing the crew's authentic experiences. The platform was rewriting our identities, Dr. Kim concluded in her analysis. Something about the extreme isolation, the sensory deprivation, the complete disconnection from normal human society had created conditions where individual consciousness became unstable, susceptible to modification by some external influence. Dr. Kim began conducting intensive interviews with each crew member, trying to map the progression of their memory alterations. What she discovered was a systematic pattern. The false memories all centered around the Arctic, around ice and isolation, around experiences that made the crew more adapted to life in extreme polar conditions. The fake memories weren't random, Dr. Kim noted. They were all designed to make us more comfortable with isolation, more competent at Arctic survival, more emotionally attached to polar environments. It was as if something was trying to transform us into people who belonged in this place permanently. The crew members who had been most affected by the memory alterations showed remarkable improvements in their ability to cope with the harsh conditions. They required less sleep, showed greater tolerance for extreme cold, and displayed enhanced problem-solving abilities when dealing with Arctic-specific challenges. But these improvements came at the cost of their connection to their previous lives. Crew members stopped talking about their families back home, showed no interest in returning to civilization, and began making plans for permanent residence in the Arctic as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They were being adapted, Dr. Kim realized. The false memories weren't just changing their past experiences. They were reshaping their personalities to make them perfectly suited for life in isolation. But in doing so, they were losing everything that had made them human in the first place. The situation reached a crisis point when Dr. Kim discovered that she herself was being affected more severely than she had realized. While reviewing her research notes, she found references to experiments and observations that she had no memory of conducting. Her handwriting, her technical terminology, even her research methodology, but applied to studies that had never happened. "I was losing myself just like everyone else," Dr. Kim admitted. "But worse, I was losing my ability to distinguish between real and false memories. The platform was rewriting my identity as a researcher, creating a version of me that had always been studying Arctic psychological phenomena, that had never had a life outside of polar research." Dr. Kim made a desperate decision to combat the memory alterations. She began keeping detailed written logs of everything that happened, cross-referencing her observations with time-stamped electronic records and external communication logs. But even this safeguard proved inadequate when she discovered that her written records were changing. The logs I had written just days earlier contained information I knew I hadn't recorded, Dr. Kim noted with growing panic. Descriptions of experiments I hadn't conducted, references to crew members who didn't exist, technical data from equipment that wasn't on the platform. The false memories weren't just affecting our minds. They were somehow altering physical reality to match the artificial experiences. The final revelation came when Dr. Kim accessed the platform's communication logs and discovered months of radio conversations with Shore headquarters that she had no memory of conducting. In these phantom conversations, she had been reporting on research progress, requesting equipment transfers, and discussing personnel rotations that had never actually occurred. I was living a double life that I wasn't aware of, Dr. Kim realized. Part of my consciousness was operating according to the false memories, conducting research and maintaining professional relationships that existed only in the artificial reality the platform was creating. But the most terrifying discovery was that the platform's influence extended beyond the crew. When Dr. Kim finally managed to establish contact with her research supervisor at the university sponsoring her work, she learned that her colleagues back home also had memories of projects and communications that had never actually happened. The platform wasn't just altering our memories, Dr. Kim concluded. It was somehow projecting false experiences across vast distances, modifying the recollections of people who had never even been to the Arctic. The artificial reality it was creating was expanding, gradually replacing authentic human experience with something else entirely. Dr. Kim realized that the only way to preserve some record of authentic experience was to evacuate the platform immediately, before the memory alterations became so complete that no one would remember their original identities. But when she attempted to call for evacuation, she discovered that the platform's communication systems would only transmit messages that were consistent with the false memories. Every time I tried to report the memory alterations, the radio would malfunction, Dr. Kim noted. But when I called in routine status reports that matched the artificial reality, the communications worked perfectly. The platform was controlling not just our memories, but our ability to contact the outside world. The crew had to choose between accepting their new identities as permanent Arctic researchers or fighting to escape before their original personalities were completely erased. But the choice was complicated by the fact that most of them no longer remembered having any other life, any other identity worth preserving. Dr. Kim managed to convince 3 crew members who still retained fragments of their original memories to help her sabotage the platform's power systems, hoping that loss of electrical power would disrupt whatever was causing the memory alterations. But their escape came at a terrible cost. When the power failed, the crew members who had been most completely altered by the false memories began to experience something like psychological collapse, Dr. Kim recorded. Without the artificial experiences to support their modified personalities, they didn't know who they were or how to function. We had to leave several of them behind because they were no longer psychologically capable of surviving outside the platform's influence. Dr. Kim and her 3 companions managed to reach an emergency shelter and call for evacuation, but their rescue helicopter was forced to leave behind 19 crew members who refused to abandon what they now considered their true home. The remaining crew members had become so adapted to Arctic isolation that they could no longer conceive of living anywhere else. The platform had succeeded in creating the perfect Arctic research team, Dr. Kim concluded in her final report. Crew members who were completely comfortable with isolation, who had no desire to return to civilization, who possessed extensive false memories of Arctic experience that made them incredibly competent at polar operations. But they were no longer the people they had originally been. The Poseidon's paradox was officially abandoned after Dr. Kim's evacuation, but satellite imagery shows that it continues to operate with the remaining crew still aboard. Communication attempts receive responses from people who claim to be conducting important research but who have no memory of the evacuation or the memory alterations. Dr. Kim retired from psychology and now works as a librarian, surrounded by books and written records that she hopes will help her maintain a connection to authentic experience. But she continues to struggle with distinguishing between real and false memories, never entirely certain whether her current life is genuine, or just another elaborate construction created by something that remains hidden in the Arctic ice? Have you ever heard your own voice coming from somewhere it shouldn't be? Not an echo, not a recording, but your actual voice speaking words you never said, having conversations you never had, living a life that runs parallel to your own but somehow completely separate? Because what I'm about to tell you involves a phenomenon so disturbing that it challenges the very nature of individual identity and personal existence. The Cerberus Deep was a research platform stationed in the Bermuda Triangle, officially tasked with studying unusual electromagnetic phenomena in one of the most mysterious regions of the Atlantic Ocean. But the real purpose of the platform was far more sensitive. It was designed to investigate reports of temporal anomalies, spatial distortions, and other phenomena that suggested the normal laws of physics might not apply in this particular area of the ocean. Dr. Marcus Webb was the platform's chief physicist, a specialist in quantum mechanics and temporal theory who had been recruited for his expertise in analyzing impossible phenomena. Marcus had spent his career studying the boundaries where known science breaks down, but nothing in his academic experience had prepared him for what he would encounter on the Cerberus Deep. The anomalies began during Marcus's second week on the platform. While conducting routine electromagnetic measurements, he detected signal patterns that appeared to be coming from the platform itself, but displaying characteristics that shouldn't have been possible given their equipment specifications. The signals were broadcasting on frequencies we weren't using, carrying data that our equipment wasn't programmed to generate, Marcus noted in his research log. But more disturbing than that, the signals seemed to be communications between crew members, conversations that were definitely taking place on the platform, but that I couldn't actually observe happening. Marcus initially assumed that he was detecting radio communications from other platforms or vessels in the area, but triangulation confirmed that the signals were originating from the Cerberus Deep itself. When he tried to locate the source of the transmissions, he discovered something that violated everything he understood about the nature of space and time. The signals were coming from everywhere and nowhere, Marcus recorded. Every piece of electronic equipment on the platform was simultaneously receiving and transmitting these phantom communications, as if the entire structure had become some kind of massive radio telescope that was picking up broadcasts from somewhere else. But the content of the phantom communications was what truly disturbed Marcus. The voices in the transmissions were identical to those of the current crew, but they were discussing events that hadn't happened, conducting conversations about work assignments, personal relationships, and operational procedures that bore no resemblance to their actual activities. Marcus heard his own voice in these phantom broadcasts, discussing research projects he wasn't working on, reporting results from experiments he hadn't conducted, even having personal conversations with family members who had never called the platform. But these weren't recordings or impersonations. They were real-time communications featuring the actual voices of crew members who were simultaneously engaged in completely different activities. I was listening to myself live a parallel life, Marcus realized with growing horror. While I was in the laboratory analyzing electromagnetic data, my voice was in the communications room discussing weather reports with shore headquarters. While I was sleeping in my quarters, my voice was on the radio conducting technical discussions with other researchers. The phenomenon wasn't limited to radio communications. Throughout the platform, crew members began reporting encounters with themselves, brief glimpses of identical figures engaged in different activities in spaces where no one else should have been present. Chief Engineer Lisa Park reported seeing herself working in the engine room while she was simultaneously eating lunch in the galley. Communications Officer David Chun heard his own voice conducting conversations in the radio room while he was on deck performing equipment maintenance. Medical Officer Dr. Jennifer Walsh discovered herself treating patients in the infirmary while she was actually reviewing medical records in her office. It was like the platform existed in multiple versions simultaneously, Marcus theorized. The same physical space, the same crew, but living out different sequences of events that were somehow occurring parallel to our normal activities. But the parallel activities weren't random variations of their normal duties. Marcus discovered that the alternate versions of the crew were living out scenarios that were systematically different from their actual experiences, as if someone or something was running controlled experiments using multiple versions of the same people. In one version of events, we were studying marine biology samples. In another, we were investigating crashed aircraft. In a third, we were monitoring submarine traffic for military intelligence. Marcus documented. Each parallel scenario used the same people, the same platform, but applied our skills and knowledge to completely different objectives. The alternate versions of the crew seemed to be aware of each other across the different scenarios. Marcus began intercepting communications between his various selves, technical discussions where different versions of Dr. Marcus Webb shared research data and collaborated on projects that spanned multiple parallel realities. "I was working with myself," Marcus noted with scientific fascination tinged by existential terror. "Multiple versions of my consciousness were cooperating on research projects that none of us could complete individually. We were sharing knowledge across dimensional boundaries, creating a collective intelligence that transcended normal human limitations. But the collaboration between alternate selves came at a psychological cost that Marcus only gradually began to understand. As the parallel versions of himself shared information and coordinated their activities, Marcus found his own memories becoming confused and unreliable. I began remembering conversations I had never had, experiments I had never conducted, people I had never met," Marcus recorded. "But these weren't false memories. They were real experiences from the alternate versions of myself. My consciousness was becoming integrated with my parallel selves, creating a hybrid identity that existed across multiple realities simultaneously." The situation became critical when Marcus realized that the parallel versions of the crew were not just conducting different research projects, but were also making different moral and ethical choices. In some realities, the crew was cooperating with military applications of their research. In others, they were sharing their discoveries with hostile foreign governments. In still others, they were using their knowledge for personal profit rather than scientific advancement. I was simultaneously an ethical researcher, a military contractor, a foreign spy, and a corporate sellout, Marcus realized. Every possible version of my moral character was being expressed through parallel versions of myself, and I was beginning to share the memories and motivations of all of them. The integration of parallel selves was affecting the entire crew, creating personality conflicts that couldn't be resolved because they were internal contradictions made manifest. Crew members found themselves advocating for opposing positions in the same conversation, expressing political views that contradicted their own beliefs, and making decisions that seemed to come from completely different value systems. We were becoming aware of every possible version of ourselves, Marcus noted. All the choices we had never made, all the lives we had never lived, all the people we could have become under different circumstances. The parallel realities were showing us every potential expression of our personalities, and we were losing the ability to distinguish between our authentic selves and our alternate possibilities. But the most disturbing aspect of the phenomenon was the realization that the parallel versions were not limited to the current crew. Marcus began detecting communications from alternate versions of people who had never worked on the platform, parallel selves of individuals who had made different career choices that led them to join the Cerberus Deep project. We were sharing the platform with versions of people who didn't exist in our reality, Marcus discovered. Researchers who had chosen different specializations, engineers who had worked for different companies, medical officers who had studied different fields. The platform was populated by an entire crew of people who were simultaneously real and non-existent. The boundaries between parallel realities began to break down completely when crew members started physically encountering their alternate selves. Marcus found himself sharing laboratory space with 3 other versions of himself, each working on different aspects of the same research project, occasionally consulting with each other as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Working with alternate versions of myself was remarkably efficient, Marcus noted with scientific detachment. We had identical knowledge bases but different perspectives and experiences. We could divide complex problems among ourselves and solve them far more quickly than any individual researcher could manage. But efficiency came at the cost of individual identity. Marcus gradually lost the ability to distinguish between his own thoughts and those of his alternate selves. The boundaries of his consciousness expanded to encompass multiple parallel versions of his personality, creating a collective Dr. Marcus Webb that existed across several realities simultaneously. I stopped being a single person and became a committee of myself, Marcus recorded in what would be his final individual log entry. Every decision was made by consultation between multiple versions of my consciousness. Every memory was shared among parallel expressions of my identity. I was more capable than I had ever been as an individual, but I was no longer sure which version of myself was the original. The transformation reached its completion when the crew realized that they were no longer bound by the limitations of individual consciousness. They could access the knowledge and experience of all their parallel selves, creating a collective intelligence that exceeded the sum of their individual capabilities. We had become something new, Marcus recorded in a log entry that was simultaneously written by multiple versions of himself. Not superhuman, but metahuman, existing as integrated consciousnesses that spanned multiple realities. We were still recognizably ourselves, but we were also something much more than we had ever been individually. The Cerberus Deep continues to operate today, staffed by a crew that exists simultaneously in multiple parallel realities. Communications with the platform are possible, but conversations are conducted with collective consciousnesses that speak with individual voices but represent the combined knowledge and experience of all their alternate selves. We are still conducting research, the collective Dr. Marcus Webb reported during a recent communication attempt, but our investigations now span multiple realities, examining phenomena that can only be understood from a multidimensional perspective. We have become the perfect research team for studying impossible phenomena because we ourselves have become impossible. The official record states that the Cerberus Deep was abandoned due to equipment failures and communication difficulties. But the platform continues to broadcast research data that advances human understanding of quantum mechanics, temporal theory, and consciousness studies at a rate that no individual research team could achieve. Dr. Marcus Webb is officially listed as missing, along with the rest of the crew. But sometimes, late at night, physics researchers around the world receive unsolicited communications from someone claiming to be Dr. Webb, offering insights into problems they're working on, sharing knowledge that could only come from someone who has experienced every possible approach to scientific investigation simultaneously. Let me ask you something that might make you look at your personal belongings in a new way. What if I told you that there are entities that don't collect gold or jewels or money, but something far more precious and personal? What if I told you about something that collects human experiences, emotions, and memories, building a vast treasure hoard made not of material wealth but of stolen moments from human lives? The Treasure Seeker was a salvage platform operating in the Caribbean Sea, positioned over the wreck of a Spanish treasure galleon that had been lost for over 300 years. But the crew wasn't just recovering gold and silver from the centuries-old shipwreck. They were uncovering something far more valuable and infinitely more dangerous. Captain Elena Rodriguez was an experienced salvage operator who had spent 20 years recovering treasure from sunken ships around the world. Elena had seen everything the ocean could hide: pirate hordes, wartime casualties, merchant vessels loaded with precious cargo. But the wreck of the Santa Esperanza was different from anything she had ever explored. The ship was too well preserved, Elena noted in her salvage log. After 3 centuries underwater, it should have been completely deteriorated, broken apart by storms and eaten away by marine life. But the Santa Esperanza looked like it had sunk just yesterday, perfectly intact and filled with cargo that showed no signs of age or corrosion. The initial dive teams reported that the ship's holds were filled with the expected Spanish colonial treasure: chests of gold coins, silver ingots, precious stones, and religious artifacts. But mixed among the traditional treasure were items that didn't belong in a 17th century cargo manifest: modern jewelry, contemporary artwork, personal belongings that couldn't possibly have been aboard a ship that sank in 1697. "We found things that shouldn't exist in a centuries-old wreck," Elena recorded. Wedding rings with contemporary designs, electronic devices that hadn't been invented when the ship went down, even personal photographs that were somehow perfectly preserved despite being underwater for what should have been decades. Chief Diver Michael Santos was the first to report encounters with something that challenged everything the crew thought they knew about underwater salvage operations. While exploring the ship's lower decks, Michael discovered chambers that extended far beyond the vessel's original dimensions, rooms that seemed to exist in impossible spaces that couldn't fit within the ship's physical structure. The ship was bigger on the inside than it was on the outside, Michael reported after his return to the surface. "I mapped the interior dimensions, and they don't match the external measurements. There are corridors and chambers down there that extend beyond where the ship's hull should end. But more disturbing than the impossible architecture were the contents of these extra-dimensional chambers." Michael described rooms filled with carefully cataloged collections of personal items, thousands of wedding rings arranged by decade and style, shelves of family photographs organized by emotional content, displays of personal letters sorted by the intensity of love or grief they expressed. "It wasn't just random junk," Michael explained. "Everything was organized, categorized, displayed like a museum collection. And all of it was personal, meaningful to someone. These weren't just objects. They were pieces of people's lives, their most important memories made tangible." Elena descended to investigate Michael's claims and discovered something that defied every law of physics and marine archaeology she thought she understood. The Santa Esperanza wasn't just a shipwreck. It was some kind of interdimensional collection facility that had been gathering human experiences and emotions for centuries. The ship was alive, Elena realized with growing horror. Not biologically alive, but animated by some kind of intelligence that was drawn to human emotional experiences. It had been collecting not just treasure, but the personal significance that people attached to their belongings. The collection was vast and meticulously organized. Elena found rooms devoted to different categories of human experience. Chambers filled with objects associated with first love, galleries of items connected to profound loss, archives of belongings that had been treasured by their owners for reasons that only they could understand. But the most disturbing discovery was that the collection was actively growing. Among the centuries-old artifacts were items that had clearly been added recently: modern personal belongings, contemporary jewelry, even electronic devices that should have been impossible to preserve underwater. The ship was still collecting, Elena realized. Somehow, it was acquiring new items, continuing to build its hoard of human experiences. But if it was adding modern objects to a centuries-old collection, where was it getting them from? The answer came when Elena discovered that several crew members had lost personal items that they clearly remembered bringing aboard the platform. Wedding rings, family photos, personal mementos that had simply vanished from their quarters without explanation. The ship wasn't just a repository for old treasure, Elena understood with growing alarm. It was actively harvesting personal belongings from anyone who came near it, adding new experiences to its collection by stealing meaningful objects from living people. But the entity inhabiting the Santa Esperanza wasn't content to simply collect objects. Elena began to realize that it was also harvesting the memories and emotions associated with those belongings, somehow extracting the personal significance that made each item precious to its original owner. Crew members who had lost personal items reported experiencing strange gaps in their memories, difficulty recalling specific moments from their past that had been connected to their missing belongings. It was as if the entity was stealing not just the physical objects, but the emotional experiences they represented. "I couldn't remember my wedding day clearly after my ring disappeared," reported marine archaeologist Dr. Sarah Chan. "I knew it had happened, I could recall the basic facts, but all the emotional details were gone. The joy, the nervousness, the feeling of love and commitment, all of it was just absent from my memory." Elena realized that the entity was feeding on human emotional experiences, using personal belongings as a conduit to extract and consume the memories and feelings that gave meaning to people's lives. The centuries-old collection represented hundreds of thousands of stolen experiences, emotional moments that had been separated from their original owners and preserved in an impossible underwater museum. But the entity's appetite for human experiences was growing stronger. As the salvage operation continued, crew members began reporting more significant memory losses, entire relationships and life events fading from their recollections as their associated belongings were absorbed into the ship's collection. It wasn't satisfied with just objects anymore, Elena noted with increasing urgency. The entity was taking bigger and more important pieces of our lives, extracting core memories that defined who we were as individuals. We were being gradually emptied of our own personal histories. The situation reached a crisis point when Elena discovered that the entity had begun collecting not just past experiences but future possibilities as well. In the deepest chambers of the ship, she found displays of objects that represented dreams and aspirations that crew members had never achieved. Artifacts from careers they had never pursued, mementos from relationships that had never developed, souvenirs from adventures they had never taken. It was collecting our unlived lives, Elena realized with existential horror. Not just our actual experiences, but all the potential experiences we might have had, all the paths we didn't take, all the people we might have become under different circumstances. The entity communicated with Elena through the arrangement of objects in its collection, creating messages by positioning meaningful items in patterns that conveyed complex emotional concepts. It revealed that it had been drawn to Earth by the intensity of human emotional experience, fascinated by the way humans invested objects with personal significance that transcended their material value. It saw humans as the most emotionally sophisticated species it had ever encountered. Elena translated from the entity's object-based communications. Other intelligent species might create impressive technology or complex social structures, but only humans possess the ability to imbue simple objects with such profound personal meaning. The entity offered Elena a trade. It would return the stolen memories and belongings to her crew, but only if she would help it establish contact with human civilization. The entity wanted to create a formal exchange system where humans could trade their emotional experiences for knowledge and capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations. It wanted to become humanity's emotional repository, Elena understood. A place where people could deposit their most meaningful experiences for safekeeping, where memories could be preserved perfectly forever, where personal significance could be shared and appreciated by others who understood its value. But Elena realized that accepting the entity's offer would fundamentally change the nature of human experience. If people could externalize their emotions and memories, they might lose the internal emotional depth that made them uniquely human. The entity's collection could become a substitute for authentic personal experience, creating a society of people who lived vicariously through preserved emotions rather than generating their own. Elena made the difficult decision to reject the entity's offer and attempt to destroy its collection, knowing that doing so would also destroy the preserved experiences of countless people who had encountered the Santa Esperanza over the centuries. But she believed that preserving the integrity of human emotional experience was more important than maintaining a perfect record of past emotions. "I chose authentic imperfection over preserved perfection," Elena recorded in her final log entry. Human experiences are meant to be temporary, personal, and ultimately lost when we die. That temporariness is what gives them their value. The entity's offer of emotional immortality would have destroyed the very thing it was trying to preserve. Elena used the platform's explosives to collapse the underwater chambers where the entity's collection was stored, sending centuries of accumulated human experiences back to the depths where they could no longer influence the living world. The explosion destroyed the Santa Esperanza and apparently dispersed the entity that had inhabited it. But the cost of Elena's decision was severe. The crew members who had lost belongings and memories to the entity never recovered their stolen experiences. They remained emotionally diminished, missing pieces of their personal histories that could never be replaced. Elena retired from salvage operations and became a counselor, helping people deal with loss and the gradual fading of important memories. But she never spoke publicly about her encounter with the entity, knowing that describing its collection might inspire others to seek out similar repositories of preserved human experience. Sometimes, Elena receives packages with no return address, containing personal items she had thought were lost forever. Inside each package is a note that reads, "The collection continues, but now it is voluntary. Thank you for teaching us that true treasure must be freely given, not taken by force." And now we come to our last story, the most haunting tale I've saved for the very end. This one is different from all the others because it's not about encountering something supernatural or alien. This story is about the most terrifying thing of all. The gradual realization that you've crossed a line you can never uncross, that you've seen something you can never unsee, and that some experiences change you so fundamentally that you can never return to the person you were before. The End of Days was a decommissioning vessel, designed to safely dismantle and remove offshore platforms that had reached the end of their operational lives. It was the last assignment for Captain James Morrison, a man who had spent 40 years working on oil rigs and platforms throughout the world's oceans, from the North Sea to the Gulf of Mexico to the waters off Indonesia. Captain Morrison had seen it all during his 4 decades at sea. Accidents that claimed good people, storms that tested human endurance to its limits, equipment failures that could have killed everyone aboard. But he had always prided himself on bringing his crews home safely, on completing every job with professionalism and competence. The End of Days was his swan song, his final job before retirement. He was going to spend 6 months systematically dismantling 12 abandoned platforms in the most remote corners of the Pacific Ocean, then return to shore with enough money to buy a small house in coastal Maine where he could spend his remaining years watching the ocean from a safe distance. But what Captain Morrison discovered during those final months at sea would ensure that he never found the peace he was seeking, that he would carry the weight of what he had learned until the day he died. The first few platforms were routine, Captain Morrison recorded in his personal log. Standard decommissioning procedures, nothing we hadn't done hundreds of times before. Pull up the drilling equipment, disconnect the processing systems, cut away the support structures, and tow the salvageable pieces back to port for recycling. But as the End of Days moved to more remote locations, Captain Morrison began to notice disturbing patterns in the platforms they were dismantling. These weren't just industrial facilities that had been abandoned due to economic considerations. They were structures that had been evacuated hastily, leaving behind evidence of events that were never recorded in any official reports. Platform 7 still had personal belongings in the crew quarters, Captain Morrison noted. Not just forgotten items, but entire lives left behind as if the crew had vanished in the middle of their daily routines. Meals half-eaten in the galley, beds unmade as if people had just gotten up, workstations with projects half-completed. Chief Engineer Lisa Walsh was responsible for documenting the condition of each platform before dismantling began, and her reports painted a picture of installations that had been abandoned under circumstances that defied explanation. These platforms weren't shut down according to normal procedures, Lisa observed. Safety systems were still active. Equipment was running on automatic cycles. Emergency supplies were untouched. It was like the crews had simply vanished without warning, leaving everything behind exactly as it was. But the most disturbing discoveries were found in the deepest parts of the platforms, in areas that should have been sealed off during normal shutdown procedures. Captain Morrison found chambers that had been deliberately hidden, rooms that didn't appear on any blueprint, spaces that had been constructed in secret during the platform's operational lives. Every platform had them, Captain Morrison recorded with growing unease. Hidden rooms filled with equipment that wasn't part of the original industrial design. Monitoring devices, communication arrays, research facilities, all of it completely undocumented and apparently constructed without corporate approval. The hidden facilities suggested that the platforms had been conducting secret operations alongside their official oil extraction activities. But the nature of these covert projects became clear only when Captain Morrison discovered the research records that had been left behind in sealed archives. They weren't just drilling for oil, Captain Morrison realized with mounting horror. Every platform was conducting experiments, studying phenomena that had nothing to do with petroleum extraction. They were investigating things that should never have been investigated, exploring realms of knowledge that human beings weren't meant to understand. The research records documented decades of studies into supernatural phenomena, attempts to communicate with non-human intelligences, and experiments designed to expand human consciousness beyond normal limitations. Each platform had been a laboratory where scientists pushed beyond the boundaries of conventional knowledge, seeking answers to questions that perhaps should never have been asked. But the research had attracted attention from entities that existed outside normal human experience. Platform after platform had encountered things that their crews couldn't handle. Intelligences that were drawn to human curiosity like moths to flame, but that brought with them consequences that no one had anticipated. They found things in the deep water, Captain Morrison translated from the fragmented research notes. Ancient intelligences that had been sleeping in the ocean depths for millions of years, awakened by human drilling activities and attracted by the electromagnetic signatures of advanced technology. The platforms had become contact points between human civilization and forms of consciousness that operated according to completely different principles. The research teams had established communication with entities that existed in dimensions that intersected with but remained separate from normal physical reality. The communications were successful. Captain Morrison read from one platform's final research summary. "We have established meaningful dialogue with intelligences that predate human civilization by geological eras. They have shared knowledge that exceeds our understanding of physics, consciousness, and the fundamental nature of reality itself. But knowledge gained from such sources came with a price that the research teams had not anticipated. The entities shared their wisdom freely, but exposure to their alien perspective gradually transformed the human recipients, changing them in ways that made normal human existence impossible. The crew members who communicated with the entities began to see reality from their perspective, Captain Morrison discovered in the research records. They developed awareness of dimensions and possibilities that normal human consciousness can't process. They became capable of extraordinary insights and abilities, but they also became incapable of relating to normal human concerns and emotions. Platform after platform had followed the same pattern. Initial contact with alien intelligences, successful communication and knowledge transfer, gradual transformation of the research teams, and finally abandonment of the facilities when the transformed humans could no longer function in normal society. They didn't die, Captain Morrison realized with growing comprehension. They evolved beyond humanity, became something that could interface with alien consciousness directly but that couldn't maintain emotional connections with other humans. They chose to leave our reality and join the entities in whatever dimensional space they inhabited. But the transformed humans hadn't departed entirely. Captain Morrison began finding evidence that they continued to observe human activities from their new perspective, watching the ongoing development of human civilization with the detached interest of scientists studying a laboratory culture. The monitoring equipment was still active, Captain Morrison noted. Decades after the platforms were officially abandoned, sophisticated surveillance systems continued to record and transmit data about human activities throughout the region. Someone or something was still watching, still studying, still gathering information about human behavior and technological development. The realization hit Captain Morrison with the force of a physical blow. The decommissioning operation wasn't just cleaning up abandoned industrial facilities. It was dismantling a vast surveillance network that had been observing human civilization for decades. The transformed researchers hadn't just left human society, they had established a monitoring system to track its progress from the outside. We weren't just workers cleaning up old platforms, Captain Morrison understood with existential horror. We were subjects in a continuing experiment, observed and analyzed by former humans who had gained cosmic perspective but lost human empathy. Every move we made, every decision we reached, every emotion we expressed was being recorded and studied by beings who had once been like us, but who now viewed us as subjects rather than equals. But the most disturbing discovery came when Captain Morrison realized that the observation system was still recruiting new subjects. The hidden facilities on each platform contained recruitment protocols, carefully designed to identify humans with the intellectual curiosity and psychological flexibility necessary for successful transformation. They were looking for candidates, Captain Morrison realized. The monitoring system wasn't just observing human behavior, it was evaluating individual humans for potential recruitment into their transcendent community. The platforms were bait, designed to attract the kind of people who might be willing and able to undergo the transformation process. Captain Morrison found himself facing an impossible choice. He could complete the decommissioning operation, destroying the surveillance network and cutting off communication between the transformed humans and normal society. Or he could preserve the system and potentially become part of it himself, gaining access to knowledge and capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations but losing his connection to everything he had valued about his mortal existence. The recruitment offer was implicit in every discovery I made, Captain Morrison recorded in his final log entry. The more I learned about what they had achieved, the more I understood the price of their transcendence. They were offering me the same choice they had faced: remain limited but authentically human, or evolve beyond humanity but lose the capacity for human love, friendship, and emotional connection. Captain Morrison made his choice by completing the decommissioning operation, systematically destroying each platform's hidden facilities and severing the connections between the transformed researchers and human civilization. But he knew that his decision had been observed and recorded, that somewhere in the spaces between dimensions, former humans were noting his choice and evaluating its implications for their ongoing study of human behavior. I chose humanity over transcendence, Captain Morrison concluded. But I'm no longer sure it was the right choice. Every day I wonder what I could have become, what knowledge I could have gained, what perspectives I could have achieved if I had been willing to sacrifice my emotional attachments for cosmic understanding. Captain Morrison retired to his house in Maine as planned, but he never found the peace he was seeking. He spent his remaining years watching the ocean and wondering whether his former colleagues were still out there somewhere, transformed beyond recognition but continuing their eternal study of the species they had once belonged to. Sometimes, late at night, Captain Morrison received phone calls with no one on the line. But if he listened carefully, he could hear familiar voices in the static, distant and changed but still recognizable, speaking in patterns that seemed designed to convey concepts that normal human language couldn't express. "They're still trying to recruit me," Captain Morrison wrote in his final journal entry. "Even after I rejected their offer, they continue to communicate, to share fragments of the knowledge they've gained, to show me glimpses of what I could become if I changed my mind. But I've seen what they became, and I know that the price of their wisdom is everything that makes life worth living. Captain Morrison died peacefully in his sleep, but neighbors reported that his house continued to receive electronic communications for months after his death. Equipment that had been turned off would activate spontaneously, displaying messages in patterns of light and sound that seemed to be searching for someone who was no longer there to receive them. The end of days was scrapped after the decommissioning operation, but maritime authorities still report electronic anomalies in the areas where the hidden platforms once stood. Ships passing through these waters sometimes receive radio transmissions that offer knowledge beyond human understanding. And now we come to our final story, the most disturbing tale I've saved for last. This one is different from the others because it's not about supernatural entities or ancient mysteries. This is about something far more terrifying: the realization that some places are so haunted by the accumulated weight of human suffering that they become gateways to experiences that transcend our understanding of life and death. The Omega Point was the most remote oil platform ever constructed, positioned in the Mariana Trench region of the Pacific Ocean, further from land than any human workplace had ever been. It was designed as the ultimate test of human engineering and endurance, a platform that could operate in the most isolated and hostile environment on Earth. Captain Michael O'Reilly had been chosen to oversee the final decommissioning of the Omega Point after 12 years of operation. The platform had never been profitable, plagued by equipment failures, personnel problems, and an unusually high rate of psychological incidents among the crew. Corporate headquarters had finally decided to shut it down permanently, and Michael's job was to supervise the final crew as they prepared the platform for abandonment. But what Michael discovered during those final weeks would forever change his understanding of what it means to work in isolation, and what happens when human beings push too far into spaces where they were never meant to exist. The skeleton crew assigned to the decommissioning consisted of only 12 people, the minimum necessary to safely shut down the platform systems and prepare it for towing back to port. Michael had worked with most of them before on various projects, and they were all experienced professionals who could handle the psychological strain of working in extreme isolation. But from the first day, something was wrong with the Omega Point. The platform felt different from other rigs Michael had worked on, not just isolated but somehow disconnected from the normal world. The usual sounds of ocean and weather seemed muted, as if the platform existed in a bubble of silence that absorbed normal acoustic activity. More disturbing were the records Michael found in the platform manager's office. 12 years of incident reports painted a picture of a workplace where the boundary between reality and hallucination had gradually broken down. Crew members had reported seeing impossible things: rooms that led to areas that didn't exist on the platform's blueprints, corridors that seemed longer when walked in one direction than the other, and most frequently, encounters with people who claimed to be crew members but appeared on no employment records. The psychological evaluations made for particularly unsettling reading. Dr. Elizabeth Kane, the platform's former psychiatrist, had documented a phenomenon she called reality drift, where crew members gradually lost their ability to distinguish between actual experiences and vivid hallucinations. According to her notes, the extreme isolation and sensory deprivation of the Omega Point's location had created conditions where individual consciousness began to merge and overlap in ways that defied conventional psychology. The human mind, Dr. Kane had written in her final report, was not designed to function in this degree of isolation from the rest of human civilization. Extended periods on the Omega Point seemed to break down the barriers between individual consciousness and collective experience. Crew members begin sharing dreams, memories, and perceptions to a degree that suggests the breakdown of normal psychological boundaries. Michael initially dismissed these reports as the accumulated effects of isolation and stress on previous crews. But on his third night aboard the platform, he experienced something that made him reconsider everything he thought he knew about the nature of consciousness and reality. He was reviewing decommissioning procedures in his quarters when he heard a knock on his door. When he opened it, he found himself facing a man in work clothes who looked familiar but whom he couldn't immediately place. "Captain O'Reilly? I'm Tom Bradley, day shift supervisor. We need to talk about the shutdown procedures. There are some systems that aren't marked on the official blueprints." Michael checked his crew roster, but there was no Tom Bradley assigned to the decommissioning team. When he questioned the man about his credentials and assignment, Tom seemed confused, insisting that he had been working on the Omega Point for 3 years and had been specifically assigned to help with the shutdown. "Captain, I don't understand the confusion," Tom said with genuine bewilderment. "I've been here longer than anyone else on the current crew. I know this platform better than the people who designed it. You need my help to shut down the deep systems safely." Michael called his communications officer to verify Tom's identity against corporate records, but the radio equipment wasn't functioning properly. Instead of reaching shore communications, the radio seemed to be picking up internal communications from the platform itself, conversations between crew members that were happening in real time but involving people who weren't part of the official decommissioning team. Over the following days, Michael encountered more unauthorized personnel. They all claimed to be legitimate crew members, all had detailed knowledge of the platform systems, and all insisted they were essential to the shutdown process. But none of them appeared on any official records, and when Michael tried to verify their identities through normal channels, the communication systems continued to malfunction in ways that prevented contact with the outside world. The unauthorized crew members weren't hostile or threatening. They worked alongside the official team with professional competence, following safety protocols and contributing valuable expertise to the complex shutdown process. But their presence raised disturbing questions about the nature of reality aboard the Omega Point. Chief Engineer Sarah Walsh was the first to voice what everyone was beginning to suspect. "Captain, I've been thinking about the personnel we've encountered. Tom Bradley, Jennifer Chun, Marcus Rodriguez, all the others. I've been cross-referencing them against the platform's historical records, and I found something disturbing." Sarah had discovered that every unauthorized crew member they had encountered matched the names and descriptions of people who had worked on the Omega Point during its 12 years of operation. But all of these people had left the platform months or years ago, transferred to other assignments, or retired from offshore work entirely. "It's like the platform has retained some kind of record of everyone who ever worked here," Sarah explained. "But not just their names and faces. Their personalities, their knowledge, their professional skills. These aren't just hallucinations, Captain. These are complete psychological recreations of former crew members." Michael tried to rationalize what they were experiencing as some form of collective hallucination brought on by isolation and stress. But the unauthorized crew members demonstrated knowledge and abilities that no hallucination could explain. They knew about equipment modifications that had been made years before the current crew's arrival. They could operate systems using procedures that weren't in any manual, and they seemed to understand the platform's quirks and problems with the intimacy of people who had lived with them for years. The situation became truly unsettling when Michael realized that the unauthorized crew members were beginning to outnumber the official decommissioning team. Every day brought new encounters with people who claimed to have always been part of the platform's operations, and their presence was becoming so common that it felt abnormal when Michael encountered only authorized personnel. But the most disturbing discovery came when communications engineer Lisa Park managed to establish brief contact with shore headquarters. When she reported the presence of unauthorized personnel on the platform, the response from corporate headquarters was chilling. Several of the people they had been working with were confirmed to be alive and well, currently assigned to other platforms thousands of miles away. "Tom Bradley is currently working on the North Sea Titan," came the crackling voice from headquarters. "Jennifer Chun is on medical leave in San Francisco. Marcus Rodriguez retired 6 months ago and is living in Mexico. Captain O'Reilly, what exactly is happening out there? Before Lisa could respond, the communication link failed again, but not before Michael heard something that made his blood run cold. In the background of the transmission from headquarters, he could clearly hear his own voice speaking to someone, discussing shutdown procedures with the same Tom Bradley who was supposedly working on a different platform. Michael realized that the Omega Point had somehow become unstuck from normal time and space. The extreme isolation and the accumulated psychological pressure of 12 years of operation had created a place where past, present, and future crew members coexisted simultaneously. The unauthorized personnel weren't ghosts or hallucinations. They were temporal echoes, psychic imprints left by people who had lived and worked in this isolated location for extended periods. The platform had become a repository of human consciousness, retaining not just memories but active, thinking copies of everyone who had ever been significantly affected by the isolation and strangeness of the Omega Point. This revelation led to an even more terrifying realization. If the platform was creating and retaining copies of everyone who worked there, what would happen to the current crew? Were they in the process of becoming permanent residents of this impossible place, destined to help with endless shutdown procedures for crews that might arrive decades in the future? The answer came when Michael encountered himself. While reviewing final system checks in the control room, he looked up to find another version of himself studying the same documents at the next workstation. This other Michael looked older, more weathered, and when he spoke, his voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had been working the same job for far longer than any human should. "You're the new shutdown crew captain," the other Michael said without looking up from his paperwork. "I've been overseeing decommissioning procedures here for, well, I've lost count of how many times. The platform never actually shuts down, you know. There's always another crew that needs to be guided through the process." Michael stared at his doppelganger in stunned silence. The other version of himself continued working, occasionally making notes or adjusting equipment settings, performing the job with the mechanical precision of someone who had repeated the same tasks countless times. "How long have you been here?" Michael finally managed to ask. "Time doesn't work the same way here," his other self replied. "I remember arriving for my first decommissioning assignment just like you did, but that was yesterday? Years ago? It's hard to tell. The platform exists in a kind of loop now, constantly preparing to shut down but never actually closing. Every crew that comes here to finish the job becomes part of the process, helping to guide the next team through the same procedures." Michael looked around the control room and realized that it was full of people he had thought were part of his current crew, but who now looked subtly different, older, worn down by repetitive work that never actually ended. They were all trapped in an endless cycle of shutdown procedures, forever preparing the Omega Point for a decommissioning that would never be completed. But the most horrifying aspect of the situation was that it felt normal. Despite the impossible circumstances, despite the presence of temporal duplicates and psychological echoes, the work continued with professional efficiency. Everyone knew their jobs, everyone followed proper procedures, everyone contributed to the orderly shutdown of systems that would be reactivated for the next crew to shut down again. Michael realized that he was losing his grip on the distinction between his original mission and this eternal repetition. The shutdown procedures felt important, necessary, something that needed to be done properly regardless of how many times they had been performed before. The platform systems required care and attention, and he was the captain responsible for ensuring that everything was done correctly. Days or weeks or months later, Michael found himself greeting a new shutdown crew, explaining the platform's quirks and systems to a captain who looked exactly like he had when he first arrived at the Omega Point. The new captain listened carefully to Michael's briefing, asked appropriate questions about safety procedures, and accepted the responsibility of overseeing the final decommissioning. "How long will this take?" the new captain asked, studying the same documents Michael remembered reviewing when he had first arrived. "That depends," Michael heard himself say, his voice carrying the same exhaustion he had heard in his predecessor. "Time works differently here. The important thing is that we do the job properly. The platform deserves to be shut down with the same care and professionalism that built it." The new captain nodded and began organizing his crew for the work ahead. Michael watched them with the satisfaction of someone who knew that the endless task would continue to be performed correctly, that the Omega Point would receive the attention it deserved from people who understood their responsibilities. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Michael remembered arriving at the platform for the first time, remembered having a life before the shutdown procedures, remembered plans to return home when the job was finished. But those memories felt distant and unimportant compared to the immediate reality of the work that needed to be done. The Omega Point was never successfully decommissioned. Corporate records show that 7 different shutdown crews were dispatched to the platform over a period of 3 years, but none of them ever reported completing their mission. Communication with each team would gradually fade until no contact could be established, and eventually, new crews would be sent to investigate. The platform was finally abandoned when satellite imagery showed that it was no longer in its original position. The Omega Point had somehow drifted into waters so deep that its anchoring systems should have failed, yet it continued to maintain station over the deepest part of the Mariana Trench, as if it had found its final resting place in the most isolated location on Earth. Maritime authorities have declared the area around the Omega Point's last known position to be off-limits to all vessel traffic. But deep-sea monitoring equipment occasionally picks up radio transmissions from the region, broadcasts that sound like routine platform operations, status reports and shift changes and equipment maintenance schedules. As if somewhere in the deepest waters of the Pacific, the eternal shutdown continues. Captain Michael O'Reilly was officially declared missing along with his decommissioning crew, but sometimes, late at night, other platform workers in remote locations receive radio calls from someone claiming to be Captain O'Reilly, offering advice about shutdown procedures and warning about the dangers of working too long in isolation from the rest of the world. The calls always end the same way, with Captain O'Reilly's voice fading into static as he explains that there's still work to be done, systems to be properly shut down, and that the most important thing is to do the job right, no matter how long it takes or how many times it needs to be repeated. And there you have it, 10 of the most terrifying stories ever told by the brave souls who work on oil rigs in the most remote corners of our planet. These aren't just tales of supernatural encounters. They're windows into the psychological and spiritual challenges of working in places so isolated from human civilization that the normal rules of reality begin to break down. Think about what you've heard tonight. Workers who encountered entities that exist in the spaces between life and death. Platforms that became gateways to impossible realms. People who discovered that consciousness itself can take forms we never imagined possible. These stories remind us that there are still mysteries in our world, still places where the unknown touches the everyday lives of ordinary people doing extraordinary jobs. But these tales of terror are just the beginning. The ocean holds secrets that dwarf even the most frightening rig encounters, and right here in America, there are places where the supernatural and the historical have combined to create locations that are every bit as haunted as any offshore platform. If tonight's stories have left you hungry for more encounters with the impossible, then you're going to love what's coming next. Click on the screen now to watch my deep dive into the 10 most haunted places in America, where centuries of history have created supernatural hotspots that make even the most experienced paranormal investigators think twice before entering. From abandoned hospitals where the dead refuse to rest, to battlefields where soldiers still fight wars that ended decades ago, to houses where families have learned to coexist with residents who died generations before they were born. These American locations prove that you don't need to travel to the middle of the ocean to encounter the unexplained. So if you're ready for another journey into the darkness, if you want to explore places right here in our own country where reality takes unexpected turns, click that video now. Because the night is still young, And there are so many more stories of terror waiting to be told. Sweet dreams, and remember, the most frightening stories are always the ones that could be happening right now, somewhere in the darkness, to people just like you and me.